Before Rome ever set foot on British soil, the island was home to many different tribal communities. They were not united under a single ruler, nor did they think of themselves as one nation. Instead, Britain was divided among numerous peoples who spoke related Celtic languages, now generally grouped under the name Brittonic. Although these communities shared certain cultural traditions, their political interests, economies, and relationships with neighboring tribes could differ considerably. Life in Britain was already changing before the Roman conquest. Agriculture formed the foundation of the economy, but trade connected many British communities both with one another and with continental Europe. These overseas contacts were particularly strong in southern and southeastern Britain, where imported goods and Roman influence had been arriving long before Roman armies appeared. The contrast between this commercially connected lowland region and the more pastoral societies of the north and west would become increasingly important after the conquest. Rome had shown an interest in Britain since the expeditions of Julius Caesar in the 1st century BC, but permanent conquest came much later. In 43 CE, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, a large Roman invasion force crossed the Channel. Claudius had only recently become emperor and lacked the military achievements traditionally associated with powerful Roman rulers. A successful conquest offered him an opportunity to strengthen his prestige. Although Claudius briefly appeared in Britain and celebrated the victory politically, the actual campaigning was carried out by experienced Roman commanders and their armies. The Romans benefited greatly from Britain's political fragmentation. Tribal leaders did not respond to the invasion in the same way. Some resisted fiercely, while others decided that cooperation with Rome offered greater advantages. Without a unified British front, Roman forces were able to defeat their opponents separately and gradually extend their authority across much of southern Britain. Resistance certainly continued, sometimes dramatically, but Rome succeeded in establishing permanent control over the most economically valuable regions of the island. Southern and eastern Britain soon became the heartland of the new Roman province. These areas contained fertile plains, well suited to intensive agriculture, and over time, wealthy estates and villas became increasingly visible across the countryside. Some villas developed into impressive residences equipped with mosaics, baths, decorated rooms, and other features associated with elite Roman life. Their estates could produce substantial agricultural surpluses, linking the British countryside to the wider economy of the Roman Empire. The situation farther north and west was very different. Mountainous landscapes and extensive grazing lands favored pastoral farming, while local resistance made Roman control more difficult and expensive. Rather than transforming these regions as thoroughly as the southeast, Rome depended heavily on soldiers, forts, roads, and military settlements. Britain consequently became one of the most militarized provinces of the Western Empire, especially along its northern frontier. Many inhabitants of the lowland south gradually adopted elements of Roman provincial culture. Towns expanded, Roman goods became increasingly common, and local elites could participate in political and economic institutions modeled on those found elsewhere in the empire. Romanization, however, was neither immediate nor complete. People did not simply abandon their older identities. British traditions continued alongside Roman customs, creating a provincial society that combined local practices with influences arriving from across the empire. The limits of Roman expansion became especially clear in the north. Beyond the most securely controlled territories lived peoples whom Roman writers associated with Caledonia, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Scotland. Roman armies campaigned deep into the region, but permanently occupying such difficult terrain demanded enormous resources. Eventually, Rome chose to consolidate its position rather than continue an expensive attempt to dominate the entire island. The most famous symbol of that decision was Hadrian's Wall. Construction began during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, creating a fortified frontier stretching across northern Britain. It was not simply a giant defensive wall designed to seal Roman territory away from everyone beyond it. Forts, gates, mile castles, roads, and military installations turned the frontier into a carefully managed zone where movement could be observed and controlled. Rome later pushed its frontier farther north and constructed the Antonine Wall across what is now central Scotland. This new frontier was held only for a relatively short period before Roman forces withdrew south again. Hadrian's Wall therefore regained its importance and remained the more enduring boundary of Roman power in Britain. Even then, the frontier was far from an absolute barrier between two isolated worlds. Merchants, travelers, soldiers, local communities, and goods moved through and around it. People living beyond Roman territory could trade with those inside the province, while Roman military communities depended partly on regional economic networks. Hadrian's Wall was therefore both a military frontier and a meeting place between different societies. South of the frontier, Roman urban life developed rapidly. Towns were connected by an expanding road network and often included recognizable features of Roman civic life, such as forums, public baths, temples, administrative buildings, workshops, and marketplaces. These settlements became centers of government and commerce, as well as places where people from different cultural backgrounds encountered one another. Among them, Londinium became especially important. Established on the River Thames, the settlement occupied an excellent position for communication and trade. It developed into the leading commercial center of Roman Britain and eventually became one of the province's most significant cities. Its importance would survive the Roman period, and the settlement ultimately developed into modern London. Other major centers included Eboracum, modern York, as well as important settlements at Chester and Lincoln. Yet Roman Britain should not be imagined as an island completely covered with Roman-style cities and luxurious villas. Most people continued to live in rural communities, and many long-established agricultural customs survived the conquest. Traditional field systems remained in use in numerous areas, and everyday life for many farming families may have changed much more gradually than the monumental remains of Roman Britain might suggest. The grand villas of southern Britain therefore existed within a much broader countryside, where older ways of life continued. Wealthy landowners could live in residences inspired by Roman fashions, while communities only a short distance away maintained practices with much deeper local roots. Roman Britain was not culturally uniform. It was a landscape in which different levels of Roman influence existed side by side. Religion also changed during the centuries of Roman rule. Traditional British beliefs did not disappear, while Roman gods and religious customs entered the province with soldiers, merchants, officials, and settlers. Local and Roman religious traditions sometimes blended together, producing forms of worship that reflected both worlds. Christianity eventually became another part of this increasingly complex religious landscape. It probably gained a meaningful presence in Britain during the 3rd century, at a time when Christian communities were expanding throughout the Roman Empire. Its earliest followers in Britain were likely concentrated particularly in towns and among communities closely connected to Roman provincial life. Over time, Christianity became increasingly visible, especially as the religion gained greater acceptance within the empire during the 4th century. Language provides another example of the mixture that characterized Roman Britain. Latin became essential in administration, the military, official inscriptions, and much urban life. Surviving writing shows that Latin was firmly established within the province, particularly among soldiers, officials, merchants, and educated members of society. But Latin did not erase the Brittonic languages. Indigenous speech continued across Britain, especially in rural communities, and many people probably moved between linguistic worlds depending on their circumstances. A person might encounter Latin in administration, commerce, or military service, while speaking a Brittonic language within family and local community life. Roman Britain was therefore never simply a small version of Italy transplanted onto a distant island. It was a frontier society shaped by conquest, negotiation, resistance, trade, migration, and cultural exchange. In the south and east, towns, villas, and commercial networks tied communities closely to the Roman world. In the north and west, military installations and frontier systems revealed the limits of Roman control. For several centuries, these different worlds existed together. Roman roads crossed landscapes that had been cultivated long before the invasion. Latin was spoken alongside Brittonic languages. Villas stood among traditional farms, while soldiers guarded a frontier through which merchants and travelers continued to pass. The result was a distinctive Romano-British society, neither entirely Roman nor unchanged from the pre-conquest past, but something new created by centuries of interaction between Britain and the wider Roman Empire. By the beginning of the 4th century, Roman Britain was entering a period of profound economic change. Historians still debate exactly when the decline began and how quickly it unfolded, but the archaeological evidence points toward a gradual weakening from around 300 CE onward. This was not a sudden collapse in which Roman life disappeared overnight. Instead, many of the economic networks that had supported Britain for generations slowly became less reliable, production declined, and connections with the wider Roman world began to weaken. For centuries, one of the great advantages of belonging to the Roman Empire had been access to its enormous commercial network. Britain might have stood near the northwestern edge of Roman territory, but its inhabitants could obtain products manufactured hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Merchants, ships, roads, rivers, ports, and regional markets connected the province with the Mediterranean and continental Europe. Pottery provides some of the clearest evidence for these connections. Large manufacturing centers in southern Gaul produced enormous quantities of ceramics that could be transported through the river systems of Western Europe before reaching ports connected with Britain. Goods could travel northward through the Rhone corridor and eventually toward the Seine and the Channel, creating a commercial route linking Mediterranean-influenced production centers with consumers in the distant north. Some ceramics traveled even farther. Archaeologists have discovered pottery in Britain originating from North Africa, one of the major manufacturing regions of the Roman Mediterranean. The presence of such objects demonstrates just how extensive Roman commercial connections had become. A household in Britain could use an object whose journey had begun on the opposite side of the Western Mediterranean. Imported pottery was only part of the market. Britain possessed its own workshops as well, producing ceramics for regional consumption. These products were often simpler than prestigious imported wares, but they were practical and affordable. Consumers therefore had access to different types and qualities of goods, reflecting an economy sophisticated enough to support both local production and long-distance imports. During the 4th century, however, this system began to lose some of its former strength. Manufacturing activity declined in several areas, and the movement of goods became less extensive. By the 5th century, many of the commercial connections that had once supplied Britain from continental Europe had dramatically contracted. The effects were especially noticeable in southern and eastern Britain, regions that had previously been among the most closely integrated into Roman trade. The evidence becomes even more striking when archaeologists examine ordinary objects. At some sites, people appear to have searched abandoned or ruined buildings for materials that could still be reused. Metal was particularly valuable. Nails, fittings, tools, and pieces of hardware that earlier generations might simply have replaced were increasingly recovered, recycled, or adapted for new purposes. This behavior reveals much more than a shortage of individual objects. If people were repeatedly removing nails and metal fittings from abandoned structures, the industries that had once supplied these materials were probably no longer functioning at their previous scale. Construction was declining, and the specialized trades associated with it were weakening as well. Blacksmiths, builders, transporters, merchants, and suppliers all belonged to interconnected economic systems. When one part contracted, the effects could spread through many others. There was no single event responsible for this transformation. Britain's difficulties formed part of a much larger crisis affecting the Roman world. During the 3rd century, the empire experienced decades of political instability, civil war, economic disruption, invasions, and repeated struggles over the imperial throne. Emperors rose and fell with extraordinary speed, armies increasingly influenced imperial politics, and frontier regions came under growing pressure. At the height of this instability, Roman political unity temporarily fractured. Different rulers controlled separate parts of the imperial world, demonstrating just how difficult it had become for a single government to maintain authority across such an enormous territory. Britain may have been geographically distant from Rome, but distance did not protect it from these problems. In fact, the island repeatedly became involved in imperial power struggles. Political instability had serious consequences for defense. Roman Britain depended on a large military establishment, particularly because threats could emerge from several directions. Beyond Hadrian's Wall were northern peoples who remained outside Roman authority, while Britain's long coastline created another vulnerability. Raiders could cross the North Sea or the Channel and strike coastal communities with relatively little warning. By the later 3rd century, maritime attacks had become an increasingly important concern. Groups from the continental North Sea coast were becoming more visible in Roman affairs, whether as raiders, mercenaries, soldiers, migrants, or settlers. The boundary between these categories was often unclear. The same communities that fought Rome in one generation could provide soldiers for Roman armies in another. The political career of Carausius illustrates how unstable Britain had become. Carausius was a Roman naval commander involved in operations connected with the Channel and coastal defense. In 286 CE, amid tensions with the imperial government, he seized control of Britain and proclaimed himself emperor. For several years, the island effectively stood under the authority of a rival regime rather than the emperor recognized elsewhere in the Western Roman world. Carausius needed soldiers and ships to protect his position, particularly along Britain's vulnerable southeastern coastline. During this period, Germanic warriors, including men associated with the Frisians and Saxons, appear to have become increasingly involved in the military environment surrounding Britain. Some may have served as allies or mercenaries, demonstrating an important feature of the late Roman frontier. Rome often relied on outsiders to defend imperial territory against other outsiders. The southeastern coastline later became associated with what historians call the Saxon Shore. A chain of heavily fortified coastal sites developed there, although the exact meaning of the ancient term remains debated. It may have referred to a coast threatened by Saxon raiders, an area where Saxons were present in some military capacity, or a frontier whose identity developed through a more complicated combination of defense, settlement, and migration. Understanding these developments requires caution when using names such as Saxon, Anglo, or Frisian. These labels can give the misleading impression that Northern Europe was divided into clearly defined ethnic nations resembling modern states. The reality was far less orderly. Identity during this period could be remarkably flexible, and political groups frequently changed through warfare, migration, alliances, intermarriage, and the absorption of smaller communities. A migrating group might begin with one identity and gradually incorporate people from entirely different backgrounds. Warriors could join successful leaders regardless of ancestry, while communities might adopt new political or cultural identities when circumstances changed. The names recorded by Roman authors therefore provide useful categories, but they should not always be treated as precise descriptions of fixed populations. With that limitation in mind, several groups from the North Sea world became especially important to Britain's later history. The Frisians occupied coastal areas roughly associated with parts of the modern Netherlands and neighboring regions. Their position along the North Sea placed them within maritime networks that connected continental Europe with Britain. Farther east along the coast lived communities commonly identified as Saxons. Over time, Saxon groups became increasingly prominent in Roman descriptions of raiding and military activity around the North Sea and Channel. Their proximity to Britain made movement across the sea entirely practical, particularly for experienced maritime communities. Beyond the Saxon regions were the Angles, associated with territories extending toward the Jutland Peninsula and areas connected with modern northern Germany and Denmark. Together with the Saxons and other Germanic-speaking peoples, they would eventually become central to the political and cultural transformation of post-Roman Britain. These populations also shared closely related languages. The dialects spoken by Angles, Saxons, Frisians, and neighboring communities belonged to the Western Germanic linguistic world. Although differences certainly existed, their languages were similar enough that communication between many of these groups was probably possible. This linguistic relationship would later have enormous consequences. As Roman authority weakened and increasing numbers of Germanic-speaking people settled in Britain, their dialects developed within the island and contributed to the emergence of Old English. The transformation was gradual, complicated, and deeply connected with the political fragmentation that followed the end of Roman government. The important point is that this process did not begin only after Rome disappeared. Long before the traditional end of Roman Britain, the North Sea was already carrying merchants, soldiers, raiders, mercenaries, and migrants between Britain and continental Europe. Germanic peoples were already interacting with the Roman province, while Roman institutions still existed. By the early 5th century, therefore, Britain had changed considerably from the prosperous province of earlier centuries. Long-distance commerce had contracted, manufacturing had weakened, new construction had become less common, and valuable materials were increasingly reused. At the same time, imperial instability made the island more difficult to defend, while political and military connections with the Germanic societies across the North Sea continued to grow. Roman Britain's decline was consequently not a single dramatic moment, but a long transition. The economic structures of the Roman province weakened before Roman political authority finally disappeared. At the same time, the peoples who would play a major role in the next chapter of British history were already appearing along its shores, fighting against Rome in some circumstances and serving alongside it in others. The Roman world was fading, but the society that would replace it was already beginning to take shape. While Roman authority was weakening in Britain, the political landscape of Western Europe was changing just as dramatically. Among the peoples who benefited most from Rome's decline were the Franks. During the later 4th century, Frankish communities were already establishing themselves within northern Gaul, sometimes as enemies of Rome, and sometimes through agreements with Roman authorities. Over the following century, their power expanded as imperial government in the region gradually lost its ability to control territory, collect resources, and maintain effective armies. By the late 5th century, Roman authority in northern Gaul had been reduced to little more than a surviving fragment of the old imperial system. Its final important representative was Syagrius, who controlled territory around Soissons after the collapse of Roman government elsewhere in the western provinces. In 486, his forces were defeated by Clovis, the rising ruler of the Franks. The victory at Soissons eliminated one of the last centers of independent Roman power in Gaul, and helped Clovis establish the foundations of a kingdom that would eventually dominate much of Western Europe. Across the Channel, Britain was facing its own increasingly dangerous situation. During the later Roman period, the southeastern coastline became a crucial defensive zone. A network of powerful forts guarded important harbors and vulnerable sections of the coast, forming the military system traditionally known as the Saxon Shore. These installations could deal with many small-scale raids, but defending an entire province against coordinated attacks was another matter. The weakness of Britain's defenses became dramatically clear in 367 CE. In that year, Roman Britain suffered a major crisis traditionally known as the Great Conspiracy or Barbarian Conspiracy. Several hostile groups attacked Roman territory at roughly the same time, creating a situation far more dangerous than the isolated raids to which the province had become accustomed. The attackers came from several directions. Picts descended from the north, while groups described by Roman sources as Scotti crossed from Ireland. Other peoples, including Saxons, Franks, and the mysterious Atticotti, also became involved in the violence. Roman defences were suddenly forced to respond to threats across an enormous area. Even Britain's substantial military establishment struggled to contain the crisis. Frontier defences broke down, communications were disrupted, and widespread disorder followed. Some Roman soldiers abandoned their positions, and others reportedly took advantage of the chaos to participate in looting. What had begun as external attacks was therefore transformed into a much broader breakdown of security. Rome responded by sending an experienced commander named Theodosius to Britain in 368. He was the father of the future emperor Theodosius I, later remembered as Theodosius the Great. The elder Theodosius reorganized the surviving forces, restored order in important areas, and re-established Roman authority. For the moment, Britain had been pulled back from a potentially catastrophic collapse. But the recovery concealed a deeper problem. Rome could still rescue Britain when sufficient troops and capable commanders were available, yet those resources were becoming increasingly difficult to spare. The empire faced pressure along several frontiers, while internal struggles repeatedly forced Roman armies to fight other Roman armies. Britain, distant from the political centers of the empire, was particularly vulnerable whenever soldiers were withdrawn for conflicts elsewhere. A major example came in 383, when Magnus Maximus, a powerful commander based in Britain, rebelled against Emperor Gratian. Maximus crossed to the continent and took significant military forces with him. His attempt to establish himself as emperor ultimately failed, but the troops removed from Britain were not fully replaced. The province had lost part of the military strength upon which its security depended. This pattern would become increasingly familiar. Britain still belonged to the Roman Empire, but its defences were gradually being drained away. Soldiers who had once protected British towns, roads, and frontiers were needed for civil wars and continental campaigns. Each withdrawal made the province more difficult to defend, while the imperial government had fewer resources available to rebuild what had been lost. Meanwhile, threats around Britain's coastline continued. The North Sea and the Channel connected the island with communities in Ireland, northern Britain, Gaul, and the Germanic regions of continental Europe. These waters were commercial routes, but they were also pathways for migration and warfare. As Roman naval and military power weakened, crossing into Britain became easier for groups seeking plunder, land, employment, or political opportunity. Events on the continent soon made Britain's position even worse. At the end of 406, the Rhine frontier experienced a major breakdown as Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and other groups crossed into Roman Gaul. The exact circumstances of the crossing remain debated, including the traditional image of a frozen Rhine, but the consequences were devastating. Gaul descended into warfare at precisely the moment when the Western imperial government was already struggling with internal instability. Britain reacted to the crisis by producing its own imperial challengers. After a rapid succession of claimants, a soldier named Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the troops in Britain in 407. Known to history as Constantine III, he crossed to Gaul with military forces in an attempt to secure the western provinces and establish himself as a legitimate ruler. For Britain, his departure had enormous consequences. Constantine took away soldiers that the island could scarcely afford to lose. Those troops became involved in continental struggles rather than defending Britain's northern and coastal frontiers. Whatever Constantine's larger ambitions may have been, his campaign contributed to the continuing erosion of effective Roman military power on the island. By the beginning of the 5th century, Britain's inhabitants increasingly had to depend upon their own resources. Imperial authority was becoming more theoretical than practical. Rome could still claim Britain as part of the empire, but maintaining that claim required armies, money, administrators, and reliable communication. All of these were becoming scarce. Around 409 or 410, Romano-British communities appear to have rejected the authority of Constantine III. and taken greater responsibility for their own security. At almost the same moment, the Western Empire was experiencing one of the most traumatic events in its history. In 410, the Visigoths under Alaric entered and sacked Rome. Although the city was no longer the administrative center of the empire, its capture carried enormous symbolic importance. Britain could hardly have chosen a worse moment to expect substantial imperial assistance. Emperor Honorius and his government were struggling simply to maintain control over the western provinces. Protecting a distant island across the Channel was no longer among the easiest problems for the imperial government to solve. A famous document known as the Rescript of Honorius has traditionally been connected with this moment. In it, Honorius instructed certain cities to take responsibility for their own defense. For generations, this was interpreted as an imperial message to the communities of Britain, a recognition that Rome could no longer protect them. Modern historians have questioned that interpretation. It is possible that the document actually concerned Bruttium in southern Italy rather than Britain. Because the surviving evidence is ambiguous, the rescript cannot be treated with complete confidence as Rome's formal abandonment of the island. Yet the broader historical reality is much clearer. During the early 5th century, effective Roman government in Britain came to an end. There was no dramatic ceremony in which the Roman Empire officially lowered its standards, boarded its ships, and departed forever. The end came through fragmentation. Soldiers disappeared, administrative structures weakened, taxation and long-distance economic systems contracted, and local communities increasingly solved problems without meaningful assistance from the imperial government. For the people living through these events, the transformation may not initially have seemed permanent. Roman rule had survived previous rebellions, invasions, civil wars, and economic crises. An inhabitant of Britain in 410 could not know that Roman legions would never return to restore the old provincial system. What later historians recognize as the end of Roman Britain may have appeared at first to be another temporary emergency. Evidence from later writers suggests that some Romano-British communities continued to hope for imperial intervention. One of the most important sources is Gildas, a British Christian writer who composed De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, usually translated as On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain during the 6th century. Gildas presents a dramatic picture of Britain after Roman government had disappeared. His work is extremely valuable, but it must be treated carefully. He was writing long after many of the events he described, and his purpose was not to produce a modern historical account. He was primarily interested in delivering a moral and religious condemnation of the rulers and society of his own age. Nevertheless, Gildas preserves the memory of desperate British appeals for Roman military assistance. According to his account, British leaders eventually addressed a plea to Flavius Aetius, one of the most powerful Roman generals of the 5th century. Aetius was heavily occupied with maintaining Roman power in Gaul and confronting the many military threats facing what remained of the Western Empire. Gildas describes the Britons as trapped between attacks from hostile peoples and the sea behind them. Whether his dramatic language reproduces an actual letter exactly is uncertain, but the message is unmistakable. Some communities in Britain still looked toward Rome for protection, even decades after direct imperial administration had effectively disappeared. No great Roman army came to restore the province. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Empire simply lacked the resources to reconquer and permanently defend Britain. Aetius himself faced enormous challenges on the continent, including conflicts involving Franks, Visigoths, Burgundians, and eventually the forces of Attila the Hun. Britain was therefore increasingly left to determine its own future. Economically, the island had already become more isolated than it had been during the prosperous centuries of Roman rule. Imported goods became scarcer, large-scale manufacturing declined, and many of the commercial networks that had once connected Britain with Gaul and the Mediterranean faded away. Politically, the situation was even more fragmented. Without a functioning Roman provincial administration, power became increasingly local. Regional rulers and military leaders had to organize defense, negotiate alliances, and compete for resources. The unified provincial structure imposed by Rome was gradually replaced by a patchwork of smaller centers of authority. At the same time, attacks and migrations from across the sea became increasingly important. Picts remained a threat from the north, Irish groups were active along western Britain, and Germanic-speaking peoples from across the North Sea became more deeply involved in British affairs. Saxons, Angles, Frisians, and other groups could appear as raiders in one context, hired warriors in another, and settlers in yet another. This distinction is crucial because the transformation of Britain was not simply the story of one civilization disappearing and another suddenly invading. The boundaries between Roman, Briton, Germanic mercenary, migrant, ally, and enemy were often complicated. The world of the 5th century was politically unstable, and people changed loyalties according to opportunity and survival. By this point, Roman Britain had entered an irreversible transformation. The economy had contracted, military protection had weakened, continental connections had become less dependable, and communities that had once relied upon imperial institutions were increasingly forced to defend themselves. Rome had ruled much of Britain for more than 3.5 centuries. Its departure, however, was not a single event with a precise date. It was a prolonged unraveling. Legions were withdrawn, institutions stopped functioning, trade diminished, and imperial assistance failed to arrive. As Roman power receded, new rulers and new peoples moved into the political space it left behind. The end of Roman Britain was therefore not simply the end of one chapter. It created the conditions for an entirely different Britain to emerge. From the political fragmentation of the 5th century would eventually develop British kingdoms in the west and north, expanding Anglo-Saxon societies in the east and south, and a new balance of power that would shape the island for centuries to come. Our understanding of the first Germanic settlements in Britain is complicated by a basic problem. The people who witnessed these events left us very little written evidence. One of the earliest substantial accounts comes from Gildas, but he was writing roughly a century after the period he described. His work is therefore invaluable, yet it cannot be read as a straightforward eyewitness history. According to Gildas, Britain faced severe military pressure after the disappearance of Roman protection. Raids and attacks from the north and west placed increasing strain on local rulers who no longer had Roman armies available to defend them. Somewhere within this unstable political landscape, a powerful Romano-British leader and his advisors supposedly decided to seek military assistance from across the North Sea. Gildas has little sympathy for this decision. He portrays the British ruler responsible for it as arrogant and misguided, while describing the Saxon warriors who answered the invitation in openly hostile terms. In his account, these foreign fighters were offered payment and provisions in return for defending Britain against its enemies. Hiring Germanic warriors was not in itself unusual. The late Roman Empire had employed Germanic soldiers and commanders for generations, so British leaders may simply have been continuing a familiar Roman military practice. The arrangement, however, supposedly ended disastrously. More warriors arrived from overseas, increasing the strength of the Germanic forces already established in Britain. Eventually, they demanded greater rewards. When their demands were not satisfied, the relationship between employers and mercenaries collapsed. The soldiers who had originally been invited to protect British communities turned their weapons against them. For Gildas, this was a catastrophe of almost biblical proportions. Settlements were attacked, communities were displaced, and warfare spread across the country. His account was written as a moral warning rather than as a detached historical investigation, and he interpreted Britain's suffering as the consequence of political failure and sin. This makes his testimony powerful, but also difficult to separate from the religious purpose of his work. Even the identity of the British ruler involved is uncertain. Later tradition associates him with the name Vortigern, although the surviving manuscript tradition surrounding Gildas is not completely straightforward on this point. Whether Vortigern represents one historical ruler, a title, or a figure whose story was reshaped over generations remains debated. About 2 centuries after Gildas, another writer transformed this uncertain episode into a much more recognizable story. The Northumbrian scholar Bede, writing in the early 8th century, produced his Ecclesiastical History of the English People. By Bede's lifetime, several powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had already emerged, and he looked back upon the migration period from a very different perspective. In Bede's account, the characters become much clearer. Vortigern is explicitly presented as a king of the Britons, while the Germanic commanders are identified as 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa. Their ancestry is traced back to Woden, the great Germanic pagan deity from whom several Anglo-Saxon royal dynasties claimed descent. Bede also organizes the newcomers into 3 famous peoples, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. According to this traditional model, different regions of Britain were settled by different groups arriving from particular parts of northern Europe. The explanation is neat, memorable, and enormously influential. For centuries it shaped the standard account of how Anglo-Saxon England began. The problem is that the 5th century was probably nowhere near this orderly. Modern scholarship presents a much more complicated picture. The migrants who crossed the North Sea were likely drawn from many communities scattered across the coastal regions of what are now the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Some may have identified themselves with names that later writers would recognize as Angle or Saxon, while others may have belonged to much smaller groups whose identities disappeared from written history. Even the traditional category of the Jutes is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Rather than imagining 3 clearly defined nations dividing Britain between themselves, it is safer to think of a broad collection of Germanic-speaking migrants whose identities were flexible and whose communities changed after they arrived. What connected many of these newcomers most clearly was language. They spoke closely related West Germanic dialects, allowing communication across communities that were politically separate. Once established in Britain, these dialects gradually developed in new directions and eventually formed the linguistic foundations of Old English. Relations between Rome and the Germanic world had already existed for centuries. Roman writers had described peoples beyond the Rhine under broad labels such as Germani since the late Republic. By the age of Julius Caesar, Germanic-speaking populations were already deeply involved in the political and military struggles taking place along Rome's northern frontiers. The relationship was never simply one of Romans fighting barbarians. Warfare was certainly frequent, sometimes on an enormous scale, but trade crossed the frontier just as regularly. Roman coins, luxury goods, weapons, pottery, and other manufactured products moved into Germanic territories, while livestock, raw materials, enslaved people, and other commodities traveled toward the empire. Military service created another important connection. Germanic warriors frequently entered Roman armies, sometimes individually, and sometimes as organized groups. By late antiquity, men of Germanic origin could rise remarkably high within the Roman military system. The frontier separating Rome from the peoples beyond it was therefore also a region of constant cultural and economic interaction. Roman wealth may even have transformed Germanic society itself. Communities with better access to imperial markets could accumulate valuable goods and resources, strengthening certain families and military leaders. Wealth brought followers, and followers brought political power. In this way, contact with Rome may have encouraged greater social inequality and helped ambitious leaders assemble larger coalitions. Some of these coalitions eventually became formidable military powers, yet they were rarely permanent nations in the modern sense. Alliances could appear rapidly around successful rulers and disappear just as quickly after defeat or the death of a leader. Smaller communities could join stronger groups, adopt their identities, or abandon them when political circumstances changed. This process was particularly visible near the Roman frontier, where opportunities for trade, warfare, diplomacy, and military employment were greatest. Germanic communities living close to Roman territory could become deeply entangled with imperial politics. Some fought against Rome before later entering Roman service. Others received land or subsidies in exchange for military cooperation. Farther from the imperial frontier, conditions could be different. Communities along parts of the North Sea coast were often smaller and politically more fragmented. Their economic connections with Rome were less intensive than those of the powerful confederations operating directly along the Rhine and Danube. This distinction is essential for understanding what happened in Britain. The Germanic transformation of the island did not initially resemble the great migrations taking place elsewhere in the collapsing Western Roman Empire. On the continent, Rome confronted enormous political and military coalitions. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, and other groups seized or received extensive territories within former Roman provinces. Their armies could contain thousands of warriors, and their leaders established kingdoms directly upon the political foundations of the old imperial system. The Visigoths eventually created powerful kingdoms in Gaul and Spain. The Ostrogoths took control of Italy. The Vandals crossed through Western Europe and ultimately established a kingdom in North Africa. The Franks expanded across Gaul and built a political system that would become one of the most important powers of medieval Europe. Britain followed another path. The earliest Germanic settlement of the island appears to have involved much smaller groups. Instead of a single enormous army crossing the Channel and conquering Britain in one campaign, boats carrying relatively modest numbers of migrants arrived repeatedly along the eastern and southern coastline. Some groups may have contained only a few families and warriors, while others were probably considerably larger. Their motives were probably just as varied as their origins. Some men may originally have arrived as mercenaries employed by British rulers. Others came as settlers searching for land. Some undoubtedly participated in raids, while successful raiding groups could later decide to remain permanently. Families followed warriors, new migrants joined established communities, and temporary military settlements could gradually become permanent ones. There was no master plan directing this movement. Groups arrived at different times, landed in different places, and established themselves wherever circumstances allowed. Some settlements may initially have existed with the cooperation of local Britons. Others were probably created through violence. In many places, newcomers and existing populations must have lived close to one another, producing relationships that ranged from conflict to trade, intermarriage, and political alliance. This makes the traditional image of a sudden Anglo-Saxon invasion misleading. Britain was not conquered in a single coordinated operation by three united peoples called the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. What unfolded was a long and uneven transformation stretching across generations. Small settlements could grow. Successful warrior leaders could attract followers. Migrants already established in Britain could encourage relatives and allies from continental Europe to join them. As Roman institutions disappeared and Romano-British political authority fragmented, these new communities gained opportunities to expand their territory and influence. Over time, identities themselves changed. People who arrived as members of numerous small continental communities could eventually become part of larger political identities created within Britain. The categories later remembered as Anglo-Saxon were therefore not simply imported intact from Europe. To a significant degree, they developed through the experience of migration, settlement, warfare, and state formation inside Britain itself. This is what makes the 5th century so difficult to reconstruct. Later writers such as Gildas and Bede tried to impose understandable narratives on a period that had been extraordinarily confused. Gildas remembered catastrophe and betrayal. Bede saw the beginnings of the English peoples and kingdoms of his own world. Each preserved important traditions, but neither provides a complete picture. Behind their stories was a much messier historical reality. Collapsing Roman institutions, competing British rulers, foreign mercenaries, coastal raiders, migrants searching for land, shifting alliances, and small groups gradually becoming larger political communities. The end of Roman Britain was therefore not immediately followed by Anglo-Saxon England. Between those two worlds lay generations of uncertainty. Britain became a landscape in which old Roman communities, emerging British kingdoms, and newly arrived Germanic-speaking populations competed and interacted with one another. Out of that fragmented world, new kingdoms would eventually emerge, but they were the result of a long process, not a single invasion. The arrival of the Germanic peoples began with scattered groups crossing the North Sea and ended generations later with a fundamental transformation of Britain's languages, political geography, and cultural identity. One of the most lasting consequences of Germanic migration to Britain was linguistic. The communities that crossed the North Sea during the 5th and 6th centuries brought with them a collection of closely related Germanic dialects. Those forms of speech would change dramatically over the following centuries, but they eventually provided the foundations of what we now call Old English. There was never a single uniform language spoken by all of the newcomers. Migrants came from different communities scattered along the North Sea coast, and each group probably possessed its own pronunciation, vocabulary, and local expressions. Yet the differences were not necessarily large enough to prevent communication. Many of these dialects were closely related, and speakers from neighboring regions could probably understand one another without enormous difficulty. Migration itself may have accelerated the process of linguistic change. In continental Europe, small communities could preserve highly localized forms of speech for generations. Britain created a very different environment. Migrants from several regions found themselves living beside people who spoke slightly different varieties of related languages. Constant communication encouraged differences to become less pronounced, while widely understood forms became more useful. Over generations, these interacting dialects developed into larger regional varieties of Old English. The process was gradual and was closely connected with the emergence of new political communities. Later English dialect divisions were therefore not simply imported from continental Europe. They were also products of migration and centuries of interaction within Britain itself. Writing played a much smaller role in the earliest stages of this society. Most Germanic communities were not broadly literate, and everyday communication depended overwhelmingly on speech and oral tradition. Nevertheless, Germanic peoples did possess a distinctive writing system, the runic alphabet, commonly known as the Futhark. Runes had developed on the European continent centuries before the large-scale settlement of post-Roman Britain, and were ultimately influenced by Mediterranean alphabetic traditions. Their sharply formed characters were particularly suitable for carving into materials such as wood, bone, stone, and metal. Migrants carried this tradition into Britain, where a distinctive Anglo-Saxon runic system eventually developed. Runic writing was never equivalent to the extensive Latin literacy that had supported Roman government. It was generally used for much shorter texts, including names, ownership marks, memorial inscriptions, and brief messages. Even so, its presence demonstrates that the early Germanic-speaking communities of Britain possessed cultural traditions considerably more complex than the old stereotype of completely illiterate invaders suggests. Archaeology has transformed our understanding of these settlers even more dramatically. Older historical accounts often presented the end of Roman Britain as a straightforward story. Roman government collapsed, Anglo-Saxon armies invaded, the native population was defeated, and England emerged from conquest. Modern evidence makes that picture much harder to sustain. The archaeological record does not reveal the kind of widespread destruction that we might expect from a single, massive military invasion. There is certainly evidence of instability and violence in post-Roman Britain, but the earliest Germanic settlements themselves often look surprisingly modest. They resemble small agricultural communities rather than military colonies created by enormous conquering armies. Their houses were generally simple, their settlements relatively small, and farming dominated everyday existence. These were communities concerned with livestock, crops, household production, and survival. Warriors certainly existed, and conflict undoubtedly occurred, but archaeology suggests that migration and settlement were at least as important as warfare in transforming eastern Britain. Why people chose to cross the North Sea is much more difficult to determine. Archaeological remains can reveal where people lived and what they possessed, but they cannot record the private motivations of migrants. There was probably no single explanation. Economic opportunity must have played some role. Britain offered substantial areas of productive agricultural land, particularly in the east and southeast. Population levels may have fallen in some regions following the collapse of Roman political and economic structures, leaving land available for newcomers. Britain's relatively mild climate and fertile lowlands would have been attractive to agricultural communities searching for new opportunities. Migration appears to have become increasingly visible during the early 5th century, with significant settlement developing from around the 420s onward. The newcomers initially concentrated heavily in eastern and southern Britain, the same areas that had previously been among the most thoroughly integrated into the Roman provincial economy. That geographical pattern is important. Romanized southeastern Britain had depended heavily upon towns, markets, taxation, specialized production, and continental commerce. When those institutions weakened, the consequences were severe. The collapse of Roman administration, therefore, did not simply create political uncertainty. It disrupted an entire economic system. Into this changing landscape came small groups of migrants. Their earliest communities were not necessarily prosperous. Archaeological sites reveal a world far removed from the sophisticated villas and urban centers of Roman Britain. Settlements such as Beckford in Worcestershire provide glimpses of relatively poor agricultural communities. The people living there appear to have possessed limited material wealth and survived through fairly basic farming. Their lives were probably physically demanding, and the first generations of settlement may have faced considerable uncertainty. At Mucking in Essex, one of the most important early Anglo-Saxon archaeological sites in Britain, conditions appear somewhat more substantial, although still modest by Roman standards. The settlement contained numerous buildings and was occupied for generations, providing archaeologists with valuable evidence for how these communities developed. The contrast with Roman Britain is striking. Only generations earlier, southeastern Britain had contained towns supplied through international commercial networks, wealthy villas decorated with mosaics, specialized industries, and a monetary economy integrated into the Roman world. Many early post-Roman settlements operated on a far smaller and more localized scale. Yet these communities survived. By the later 5th century, the number of Germanic-associated settlements increased considerably, particularly across eastern Britain. Migration was no longer an isolated phenomenon involving only a handful of adventurers. Existing settlements grew, new communities appeared, and connections across the North Sea continued. Information almost certainly traveled in both directions. People who had successfully established themselves in Britain could communicate with relatives and associates on the continent. News of available farmland or successful settlements may have encouraged additional migration. In this way, a small initial movement could gradually develop into a self-sustaining migration network. A particularly important phase of expansion appears to have occurred roughly between the late 5th and early 6th centuries. By then, Germanic-speaking populations were becoming an increasingly permanent feature of the British landscape. But who did these people believe they were? This is one of the most fascinating questions raised by the archaeological evidence. Later historical traditions divide the settlers neatly into Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, but the earliest communities do not display such simple cultural boundaries. Cemeteries provide some of the richest evidence. Early Germanic communities in Britain practiced both cremation and inhumation. Some individuals were cremated and their remains placed in urns, while others were buried intact. Burial practices varied considerably from one region to another, and sometimes even within individual communities. People were frequently buried wearing clothing and personal ornaments. Although textiles usually decay, metal objects survive much more readily. Archaeologists therefore recover brooches, belt buckles, pins, weapons, beads, jewelry, and other objects that once formed part of a person's appearance. These objects allow us to reconstruct something of the cultural world in which the settlers lived. But instead of revealing one standardized Anglo-Saxon culture, they reveal remarkable diversity. One cemetery might favor particular styles of brooches, while another used completely different designs. Even neighboring communities could display distinct combinations of objects and burial customs. Roman traditions sometimes survived alongside styles introduced from continental Germanic regions. Some graves contain objects combining Roman and Germanic influences, reminding us that cultural identities were not divided by clean boundaries. The population of post-Roman Britain included descendants of Romano-Britons, recent immigrants, people of mixed ancestry, and individuals whose cultural affiliations could change during their lifetimes. Brooches are particularly valuable because styles can sometimes be compared with examples discovered in continental Europe. Objects from one British community might closely resemble designs known from Jutland, while those from another settlement show stronger similarities with material found in Lower Saxony or elsewhere around the North Sea. This does not necessarily mean that archaeologists can identify someone's ethnicity simply by examining a piece of jewelry. Objects could be traded, copied, inherited, or adopted by people from different backgrounds. What these patterns demonstrate more securely is the existence of numerous connections between Britain and different parts of Northern Europe. Eastern Britain was therefore not populated by one unified migrating nation, nor does the evidence support a simple picture in which three clearly separated peoples arrived and established three distinct zones of settlement. The reality was considerably more fluid. People arrived from different regions, bringing their own dialects, clothing traditions, burial customs, and social networks. Once in Britain, they encountered other migrants as well as the existing Romano-British population. Communities mixed, traditions changed, and new identities gradually emerged. This process took generations. A farmer living in eastern Britain during the middle of the 5th century may not have thought of himself using the broad political identities that became familiar in later Anglo-Saxon history. Loyalty may instead have centered on family, settlement, local leader, or a much smaller regional community. Only later, as powerful kingdoms emerged, did broader identities become increasingly important. Political expansion encouraged populations to organize themselves around new rulers and territories. Communities that had once been culturally diverse could gradually become associated with kingdoms such as Kent, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. Language developed alongside this political transformation. The many Germanic dialects brought across the North Sea interacted with one another in Britain, eventually producing recognizable varieties of Old English. Cultural identities that had once been fragmented likewise became attached to larger kingdoms and regional traditions. The archaeological picture therefore tells a very different story from the traditional image of a single Anglo-Saxon invasion. Britain experienced repeated migrations involving relatively small communities, followed by generations of settlement, interaction, adaptation, and political consolidation. Violence certainly formed part of that world, but it was only one element of a much larger transformation. Farmers mattered as much as warriors. Families mattered as much as armies. Language, marriage, agriculture, trade, and local alliances could transform a region just as profoundly as battles. What eventually became Anglo-Saxon England was not carried fully formed across the North Sea. It developed inside Britain itself. Diverse migrants arrived with different traditions and dialects, settled among equally diverse local populations, and gradually created new communities. Centuries later, those communities would possess recognizable kingdoms, laws, languages, religious institutions, and political identities. But their beginnings were far less orderly. Scattered farms, small settlements, mixed traditions, uncertain loyalties, and boats carrying new groups of migrants across the North Sea. From those modest beginnings emerged one of the most important transformations in British history, and the linguistic foundations of the English language itself. Genetic research has added an entirely new dimension to the study of post-Roman Britain. Written sources are scarce, archaeology can only reveal part of the story, and later medieval authors often described the migration period through legends shaped by their own political and religious concerns. DNA gives historians another form of evidence, allowing them to investigate who moved into Britain, how newcomers interacted with existing populations, and how much of their ancestry survives today. There are two major ways genetics can be used to investigate ancient populations. The first is ancient DNA, recovered directly from human remains. Teeth and certain bones can sometimes preserve genetic material for centuries, allowing researchers to examine the ancestry of individuals buried at particular places and times. Instead of trying to reconstruct the distant past solely from modern populations, scientists can study people who actually lived during the period in question. The second approach begins with living populations. By comparing genetic patterns among modern groups, researchers can identify relationships that reflect population movements in earlier centuries. This method is more complicated because populations have continued to migrate and intermarry ever since the early medieval period. Nevertheless, when modern genetic evidence is combined with ancient DNA, archaeology, and historical sources, it can provide powerful clues about demographic change. Studies of early medieval cemeteries in eastern England have produced particularly interesting results. They suggest that continental migrants and people with substantial local British ancestry were living within the same communities surprisingly early in the settlement period. This does not fit comfortably with the older picture of two completely separated populations, Germanic conquerors on one side and defeated Britons on the other. Instead, interaction appears to have begun almost immediately. People formed families across ancestral boundaries, and communities could contain individuals with very different genetic backgrounds. A settlement that looked culturally Germanic from its artifacts might therefore include people whose ancestry was largely local, while someone with continental ancestry might adopt practices that developed within Britain. Some genetic studies have estimated that migration from continental northern Europe made a substantial contribution to the ancestry of later English populations. The exact percentage varies considerably depending on the samples, regions, dates, and statistical methods involved. Unsurprisingly, continental ancestry tends to be more visible in eastern England, where archaeological evidence also indicates particularly intensive early Germanic settlement. Farther west, the genetic picture generally shows greater continuity with earlier British populations. Yet even regions traditionally associated with stronger Celtic cultural survival were never completely isolated. Britain experienced centuries of movement after the 5th century, making it extremely difficult to separate ancestry produced by the original migration period from genetic mixing that occurred later. For that reason, genetic percentages should never be treated as permanent historical facts. Ancient DNA is a rapidly developing field. New cemeteries are sampled, larger datasets become available, and analytical methods continue to improve. Conclusions that appear convincing today may be revised as the evidence expands. One conclusion, however, has become increasingly difficult to deny. The Germanic migration did not result in the complete biological replacement of Britain's existing population. Large numbers of people whose ancestors had lived in Roman Britain survived the political transformation and became part of the societies that emerged afterward. The newcomers made an important demographic contribution, especially in eastern regions, but they mixed with local populations rather than simply eliminating them. Some genetic research has raised an even more intriguing possibility. The process of integration may not have affected men and women equally. Researchers can compare different types of inherited genetic material. Mitochondrial DNA is transmitted through the maternal line, while the Y chromosome passes from fathers to sons. Differences between these patterns can sometimes reveal whether migration was disproportionately male or female. Certain studies have suggested that continental Germanic ancestry may be more strongly represented in paternal lines than in maternal ones. At the same time, maternal ancestry may show greater continuity with the pre-existing British population. There are several possible explanations. One is straightforward migration. Perhaps more men than women initially crossed the North Sea. This would hardly be surprising if some of the earliest arrivals were warriors or mercenaries. But another possibility is social inequality. If Germanic-speaking newcomers acquired greater political power, wealth, or social status, migrant men may have had greater reproductive opportunities than local British men. They may frequently have formed families with local women, while some native men experienced reduced access to land, status, or marriage. Such a pattern would not necessarily require mass violence or systematic extermination. Social hierarchy alone can leave powerful genetic signatures over several generations. A relatively small elite can contribute disproportionately to future populations if its members possess greater wealth, land, or reproductive success. Yet caution is essential. Dating these genetic patterns precisely is difficult, and later centuries brought additional migrations into Britain from Scandinavia, continental Europe, and elsewhere. Viking settlement in particular complicates attempts to identify which genetic signals belong specifically to the 5th and 6th century migrations. DNA, therefore, does not give us a simple replacement for traditional history. It provides another layer of evidence that must be interpreted alongside archaeology, linguistics, and surviving texts. The written sources should not be discarded either. Gildas and Bede may have simplified events, exaggerated them, or interpreted them according to the concerns of their own periods, but their narratives can still preserve memories of genuine historical developments. Gildas's famous account of foreign warriors being invited into Britain is a good example. Taken literally, his story is difficult to verify, but beneath its moralizing language may survive the memory of a very plausible late Roman practice. British leaders hiring Germanic soldiers to defend territory against other enemies. This would have been entirely consistent with the military traditions of the later Roman Empire. Germanic warriors had served Rome for generations, and Roman commanders regularly recruited soldiers from beyond the imperial frontiers. Romano-British rulers who inherited responsibility for local defense after the withdrawal of imperial forces may simply have continued a system they already understood. The political authority behind such recruitment remains mysterious. After effective Roman rule disappeared in the early 5th century, Britain did not immediately become a collection of completely isolated villages. Some elements of provincial government probably survived locally, while military commanders, landowners, civic elites, and regional rulers attempted to maintain order. The ruler remembered as Vortigern may therefore represent a genuine political figure whose history became increasingly legendary. Alternatively, later traditions may have compressed the actions of several leaders into the story of one man. The evidence is too limited to know with certainty. There are also archaeological hints that Germanic warriors were present in Britain in military roles during this transitional period. Such evidence does not prove every detail of the later stories, but it makes the general idea of Germanic mercenary service entirely credible. What happened afterward was transformed by later generations into a powerful origin story. The complicated reality of migration, military service, settlement, intermarriage, and political soldiers disappeared, gradually became the simpler narrative taxation of foreign and long-distance economic systems contracted of Britain, and local communities increasingly solved problems without meaningful assistance from the imperial government. Continued to remember that their ancestors had come from across the sea. Anglo-Saxon royal families were especially interested in continental ancestry. Their genealogies often traced rulers through long chains of heroic ancestors. sometimes extending their family lines back to legendary or divine figures such as Woden. These genealogies were political documents as much as family histories. An ancient and prestigious ancestry could strengthen a king's claim to rule. The individual names in these genealogies cannot always be accepted as historical. Generations could be invented, rearranged, or connected to famous ancestors to enhance royal prestige. Yet the larger tradition reveals something important. Anglo-Saxon society retained a strong awareness that its cultural roots extended beyond Britain. Stories reinforced that connection. Early English heroic traditions repeatedly looked across the North Sea toward Scandinavia and continental Germanic Europe. Kings, warriors, feuds, dynasties, and legendary battles from those regions remained part of the cultural imagination of Anglo-Saxon England. No surviving work demonstrates this more clearly than Beowulf. It is the greatest surviving heroic poem written in Old English, yet its story is not primarily set in England. Its world lies across the North Sea among Danes, Geats, and other Scandinavian peoples. That geographical setting is extremely revealing. Generations after Germanic-speaking communities had established themselves in Britain, their descendants remained culturally fascinated by the wider North Sea world. Stories associated with continental and Scandinavian societies continued to circulate, evolve, and acquire new meaning in England. The sea therefore did not simply separate Anglo-Saxon Britain from continental Europe. It connected them. Ships carried migrants, merchants, warriors, objects, stories, religious ideas, and political traditions in both directions. The same North Sea that had brought settlers to Britain continued to serve as a cultural highway for centuries. This helps explain why the creation of Anglo-Saxon England cannot be reduced to a single invasion. Genetics shows population mixture. Archaeology reveals diverse communities. Linguistics records the convergence of related dialects. Historical traditions preserve memories of mercenaries and migration. Literature demonstrates continuing cultural connections with the continental Germanic world. Some newcomers may have arrived as hired soldiers, others came as farmers, families, adventurers, or migrants searching for land. Some local Britons resisted them, while others lived beside them, traded with them, married them, or eventually adopted their language and customs. Political power shifted unevenly from one region to another. Over several generations, these interactions created societies that neither the inhabitants of Roman Britain nor the first continental migrants would have completely recognized. The Germanic settlement of Britain was therefore not simply a story of one population replacing another. It was a process of migration and integration, accompanied by conflict, but also by cultural exchange and intermarriage. New identities emerged from that mixture, eventually producing the kingdoms and communities we associate with Anglo-Saxon England. And even after those kingdoms had become firmly established, memories of the journey across the North Sea remained. Royal genealogies looked back toward continental ancestors, heroic traditions celebrated a Germanic past, and Beowulf imagined a world of Scandinavian kings and warriors rather than an English landscape. The migrants had made Britain their home, but they never completely forgot the world from which they had come. At first glance, the idea that Germanic settlement in Britain was largely a gradual migration rather than a single violent invasion can seem surprising. Britain's later history makes the assumption of conquest especially tempting. Viking armies would attack the island centuries later, and the Norman invasion of 1066 would transform England through an unmistakable military conquest. It is easy to imagine the arrival of the Saxons in much the same way. The evidence, however, points toward a more complicated process. Archaeology and genetics increasingly suggest that large parts of the Germanic migration occurred through repeated settlement, rather than one coordinated invasion. That does not mean 5th century Britain was peaceful. Warfare certainly occurred, and communities competed violently for territory and political influence. But the transformation cannot be explained simply as a foreign army arriving and conquering the entire country. The first migrants probably did not appear threatening enough to provoke a unified response. They arrived over many decades and in groups of very different sizes. Some may have come as families searching for land, others as warriors, and still others as mercenaries already serving British or Roman authorities. Germanic soldiers had been recruited into Roman forces before imperial rule collapsed, meaning that people from across the North Sea were already present in Britain before the traditional Anglo-Saxon settlement period had fully begun. There was also no single Germanic leadership directing the movement. The newcomers did not necessarily share one political identity, ruler, or objective. Communities from different regions of Northern Europe crossed the sea independently, established settlements, and developed relationships with local populations according to their own circumstances. Britain itself was in no position to organize a coordinated response. The disappearance of Roman government had left behind an enormous political vacuum. For centuries, the empire had maintained roads, forts, coastal defenses, military supply networks, taxation systems, and professional armies. When imperial authority collapsed, those systems could not simply continue operating on their own. The Saxon shore demonstrates the problem particularly well. Its coastal forts had once formed part of an organized Roman defensive network. Without soldiers, administrators, reliable supplies, and centralized command, however, impressive fortifications had limited value. Some continued to be occupied in various forms, but the coordinated system that had supported them was disappearing. This made Britain's eastern coastline increasingly open. Small groups could cross the North Sea and establish themselves without necessarily encountering organized military resistance. Even when local inhabitants noticed their arrival, a few boats carrying farmers or warriors might not have appeared to be the greatest danger facing communities struggling with economic contraction, political rivalry, raids, and the collapse of Roman institutions. Only in hindsight would the enormous significance of these migrations become obvious. Determining how many people crossed into Britain is extremely difficult. There are no surviving immigration records, and archaeology can identify cultural change more easily than exact population numbers. Genetics provides additional clues, but genetic ancestry cannot simply be converted into a precise number of 5th-century migrants. Various demographic models have nevertheless suggested that perhaps around 100,000 to 200,000 migrants could have entered Britain during the first century or two of settlement. Such estimates remain uncertain, but even numbers of this scale would represent migration spread across several generations rather than a single enormous invading army. The process was also geographically uneven. Eastern and southeastern Britain experienced the strongest Germanic influence, while many western regions retained predominantly British political and cultural traditions. Between these zones lay territories where identities, languages, and political loyalties were probably much less clearly defined. Some elements of the Romano-British elite almost certainly attempted to preserve their authority. Roman government had disappeared, but the people who had participated in Roman society did not vanish with it. Landowners, military commanders, civic leaders, and wealthy families survived, particularly in regions that had once contained important towns. London and other former Roman centers may have retained elements of this older elite for some time, yet preserving Roman-style authority without the Roman state was extremely difficult. There was no emperor capable of settling disputes, no dependable imperial army, and no powerful central government controlling the entire province. Instead, Britain fragmented politically. Local rulers competed with one another while simultaneously confronting threats from outside their territories. Gildas strongly emphasizes these internal divisions. Although his account is shaped by moral and religious concerns, his description of competing British leaders fits a society in which centralized authority had broken down. This fragmentation probably made organized resistance to Germanic expansion far more difficult. A British ruler might be more concerned about a neighboring British rival than about a small Germanic settlement several days away. Some rulers could even employ Germanic warriors against other Britons, unintentionally strengthening the military position of groups that would later establish independent power. Yet resistance did eventually emerge. As Germanic-speaking communities expanded and new political structures developed, competition for land and authority became more intense. British rulers could no longer regard every group of newcomers as temporary mercenaries or harmless settlers. In some regions, the balance of power was clearly changing. It is within this shadowy period of resistance that one of the most famous figures in British history eventually appears: King Arthur. Whether Arthur actually existed remains one of the great unanswered questions of early medieval history. There is no contemporary document identifying a King Arthur who ruled Britain and defeated the Anglo-Saxons. Archaeology has not uncovered an inscription announcing his reign, and the earliest surviving source describing British resistance does not mention him at all. That earliest major source is once again Gildas. Writing during the 6th century, Gildas looked back upon the disasters and wars that followed the collapse of Roman Britain. His purpose was religious rather than biographical. He wanted to explain Britain's suffering as the result of moral failure, and he used history as part of a larger condemnation of contemporary rulers. In his narrative, the British decision to recruit Saxon mercenaries becomes the beginning of disaster. The warriors were supposedly brought into Britain to help defend the country against attacks from the north. This would have continued a military practice familiar from the Roman period, when foreign soldiers were frequently employed in imperial armies. According to Gildas, the relationship eventually collapsed. The newcomers demanded greater supplies and rewards, and when these were not provided, they turned against the people who had hired them. Warfare followed, and Gildas describes the destruction in extraordinarily dramatic language. His account contributed greatly to the later idea of a devastating Anglo-Saxon conquest in which British communities were systematically destroyed. Archaeology does not support such a simple picture of universal slaughter. Nevertheless, there is little reason to doubt that certain regions experienced serious warfare. More importantly, Gildas tells us that British resistance eventually recovered, and the man he associates with that recovery is not Arthur. He is Ambrosius Aurelianus. Ambrosius is one of the most intriguing figures of post-Roman Britain, because Gildas presents him as a leader connected with the surviving Roman tradition. He appears to have come from a distinguished family, and Gildas suggests that his ancestors had possessed considerable status under Roman rule. Under Ambrosius, British forces regained enough organization to challenge their enemies effectively. The conflict did not end immediately. Instead, Gildas describes a prolonged struggle in which victories alternated between the two sides. Eventually, this period of warfare culminated in a major British victory, traditionally known as the Battle of Mount Badon. Badon occupies an extraordinary position between history and legend. Gildas treats it as a decisive moment when British forces defeated their opponents and temporarily halted their expansion. He places the battle around the time of his own birth and connects it chronologically with the decades following the arrival of the Saxons. The victory appears to have produced a significant period of relative stability. If Gildas is broadly reliable on this point, British resistance had succeeded in checking Germanic expansion for at least a generation. But there is an important detail that later traditions often obscure. Gildas never says that Arthur commanded the British army at Badon. He does not even mention Arthur. Nor does Gildas explicitly state that Ambrosius personally commanded the victorious forces at the battle. Ambrosius is associated with the revival of British resistance, but Gildas describes years of continuing warfare afterward. The commander at Badon could therefore have been Ambrosius, another British leader, or someone whose name Gildas simply chose not to record. The location of the battle is equally uncertain. Numerous sites across Britain have been proposed as Mount Badon, but none has gained universal acceptance. Without secure archaeological or textual evidence, identifying the battlefield remains speculative. For several centuries after Gildas, the surviving written record tells us remarkably little. Then, around the early 9th century, a work known as the Historia Britonum, or History of the Britons, appeared. The text has traditionally been associated with a Welsh scholar named Nennius, although modern historians are uncertain whether Nennius actually wrote it. The surviving work may instead represent material compiled from several earlier traditions by one or more unknown authors. By this stage, the story of post-Roman Britain had changed considerably. Historical memories had mixed with folklore, political traditions, genealogies, religious stories, and heroic legend. Characters who had previously appeared separately were now drawn into the same narrative. Vortigern became one of its central figures. He was presented as a ruler of the Britons, whose decisions contributed to the arrival of Germanic mercenaries. The warriors Hengist and Horsa, familiar from other Anglo-Saxon traditions, were incorporated into the story as leaders employed by Vortigern. In this version, Vortigern hires the newcomers to fight his enemies. The arrangement again ends disastrously, but the narrative has become far more elaborate than anything preserved by Gildas. Ambrosius also enters Vortigern's story. The Historia Britonum presents Vortigern as fearing Ambrosius and depicts the political world of Britain as filled with rivalry, prophecy, betrayal, and supernatural events. The story becomes stranger still when Vortigern attempts to build a fortress in western Britain. According to the legend, his construction repeatedly fails. Walls built during the day mysteriously collapse, leaving Vortigern unable to complete his stronghold. His advisors eventually offer a disturbing solution. A special child must be found and sacrificed so that his blood can secure the foundations. The child selected for this purpose is another figure associated with the name Ambrosius, but the child refuses to remain a helpless victim. Instead, he demonstrates extraordinary knowledge and exposes the ignorance of Vortigern's advisors. The episode moves completely beyond conventional political history and into the world of prophecy and legend. This strange story is enormously important because later, medieval writers would transform the mysterious prophetic child into someone far more famous: Merlin. The transformation shows how rapidly the memory of post-Roman Britain evolved. Historical figures, remembered battles, local legends, supernatural traditions, and political propaganda gradually became intertwined. Ambrosius, Vortigern, Hengist, Horsa, and eventually Arthur and Merlin would all become part of a vast legendary history of Britain's collapse and rebirth. Behind those legends, however, there appears to have been a genuine historical struggle. Germanic migration had begun gradually, probably involving settlers, families, mercenaries, and small warrior groups rather than a unified invasion force. But as settlements expanded and political power shifted, conflict with British communities became increasingly difficult to avoid. The Britons did resist. At some point during the 5th or early 6th century, they appear to have organized an effective military response. A leader remembered as Ambrosius Aurelianus played an important role, and a major victory at Mount Badon temporarily slowed the advance of Germanic power. Somewhere within the memory of those wars, the legend of Arthur would eventually emerge. Whether there was one historical warrior behind that name remains impossible to prove. Arthur may have been a genuine commander whose achievements were magnified over generations. He may represent memories of several different British leaders combined into one heroic figure. Or the legendary Arthur may have developed much later around traditions that originally belonged to people such as Ambrosius. What can be said with greater confidence is that the world behind the Arthurian legend was real. Roman Britain had collapsed. Local rulers competed for power. Germanic migrants were establishing permanent communities. British leaders fought to preserve their territories, and battles such as Badon became powerful memories of resistance. The knights, castles, round tables, and elaborate courtly world of later Arthurian literature belonged to a much later medieval imagination. The Britain from which the earliest traditions emerged was very different. Fragmented kingdoms, abandoned. Roman towns, deteriorating roads and forts, small farming settlements, competing warlords, and armies fighting for control of a landscape no longer protected by Rome. It was from this uncertain world between Roman Britain and Anglo-Saxon England that the first foundations of the Arthurian legend began to grow. The mysterious child in the Historia Brittonum does more than escape the sacrifice planned by Vortigern. He delivers a prophecy that would become one of the most enduring symbols in British tradition. Beneath the ground, two dragons are said to be locked in conflict, one white and one red. Their struggle is not merely supernatural spectacle. It represents the struggle for Britain itself. The white dragon stands for the Saxons, while the red dragon represents the native Britons. For Vortigern, the prophecy is deeply unsettling. The child identified with Ambrosius is not simply a miraculous figure, but someone associated with prestigious Roman ancestry. The tradition presents him as the son of a Roman consul, giving him a status that immediately threatens Vortigern's position. Even long after imperial government had disappeared from Britain, association with Rome could still carry enormous political weight. Roman ancestry represented legitimacy, authority, education, and connection with a world whose institutions had once dominated the island. In the story, Vortigern eventually gives Ambrosius authority over part of southern Britain and withdraws elsewhere. Whatever historical reality may lie beneath this tale, its symbolism is revealing. Generations after Roman rule had ended, British writers could still imagine Roman heritage as a powerful source of political legitimacy. The Historia Brittonum then introduces the figure who would eventually overshadow almost everyone else in the story: Arthur. Interestingly, Arthur is not presented as a king. Instead, he receives the Latin title Dux Bellorum, essentially identifying him as a commander or leader in war. This distinction matters because the same text has no difficulty referring to kings elsewhere. Vortigern is treated as a king, and the author even speaks collectively of Britain's various kings. Arthur, however, seems to occupy a different position. This has led to endless speculation. Perhaps the tradition remembered Arthur as a military commander who coordinated several British rulers against a common enemy. Perhaps he served one or more kings. Perhaps Dux Bellorum was simply the author's attempt to describe a legendary warrior whose original political position had already been forgotten. The evidence does not allow a confident answer. What the text does provide is an impressive military career. Arthur is credited with fighting a sequence of 12 battles against the Anglo-Saxons. The locations range across Britain, although identifying many of them on a modern map is extremely difficult. Some names may preserve genuine geographical memories, while others may have been transformed through centuries of oral transmission. The final and greatest confrontation is Mount Badon. Here the story reaches heroic proportions. Arthur is said to have destroyed an extraordinary number of enemies through his own attack. Such numbers clearly belong to heroic storytelling rather than reliable battlefield reporting. The images of Arthur as an almost superhuman warrior, personally responsible for victory on an astonishing scale. This is a major development in the tradition. In Gildas, Badon is an important British victory, but Arthur never appears. Ambrosius Aurelianus is the named figure associated with the revival of British resistance, although Gildas does not clearly identify him as the commander at Badon itself. Several centuries later, the Historia Brittonum places Arthur at the center of the victory. The other battles attributed to Arthur create similar problems. Some appear to have connections with older Welsh traditions, but there is little evidence that they originally belonged to a single historical commander's career. It is possible that victories remembered from different regions and periods gradually accumulated around Arthur's name. That process is common in heroic tradition. Once a warrior becomes famous enough, stories that originally belonged to other people can be attached to him. Separate local heroes gradually become one national hero, and generations of warfare can be compressed into the lifetime of a single extraordinary figure. Another major source, Bede, complicates the picture even further. Bede was one of the greatest scholars of early medieval England. Writing during the early 8th century, he attempted to reconstruct the history of the English peoples from their conversion to Christianity and from earlier traditions concerning post-Roman Britain. When discussing British resistance to the Germanic settlers, however, Bede follows Gildas closely. His central figure is Ambrosius Aurelianus rather than Arthur. Bede repeats much of the basic narrative of disaster, followed by British recovery. Although Bede himself belonged to the Anglo-Saxon cultural world, his reliance on Gildas means that this section of his history preserves much of the older British perspective. The Britons suffer, recover, and eventually achieve an important victory, with divine assistance playing a role in Bede's Christian interpretation of events. Bede also knows about Mount Badon. He places the battle around the end of the 5th century, traditionally somewhere near the 490s. Yet once again, Arthur is absent. That silence is difficult to ignore. If Arthur had already been universally remembered as the great victor of Mount Badon, why did two important early writers fail to associate him with the battle? There are several possible answers, but none can be proven. Perhaps Arthur existed, but was irrelevant to the purposes of Gildas and Bede. Perhaps his connection with Badon developed later. Or perhaps Arthur was originally a legendary figure whose story gradually absorbed the achievements of historical British commanders. What makes the question even more intriguing is that Arthurian traditions were clearly circulating independently. By the 7th century and afterward, references to Arthur began appearing in Welsh and related Brittonic traditions. Many of these references are frustratingly brief. They do not introduce Arthur or explain who he is. Instead, they mention him as though audiences already knew the character. That familiarity is important. It suggests that Arthur had become a recognizable heroic figure long before the great medieval romances were written. His legend was already circulating through oral traditions, stories, poetry, and regional folklore. This early Arthur was nothing like the king most people imagine today. There was no magnificent Camelot, no elaborate round table, no Lancelot-Guinevere romance, and no fully developed quest for the Holy Grail. Those elements belonged to much later centuries. The earliest Arthur was primarily a warrior, a defender of Britain associated with extraordinary martial ability and resistance against enemies. This brings us back to Ambrosius. Could Arthur and Ambrosius have originally been the same person? The possibility has fascinated scholars because it would solve several problems at once. Ambrosius is the best attested named British resistance leader in the earliest surviving account. Arthur later becomes the great resistance hero and receives credit for Badon. Perhaps, according to this theory, the two traditions preserve different memories of one historical commander. The difficulty is that there is no convincing evidence connecting their names. Attempts to derive Arthur linguistically from Ambrosius Aurelianus have not produced a generally accepted explanation. More importantly, the historical evidence for Ambrosius is considerably stronger than the evidence for Arthur. A more plausible possibility is that the achievements of Ambrosius and perhaps other forgotten British commanders gradually became attached to Arthur. Imagine how such a process could unfold. A genuine commander wins important battles. Decades later, songs and stories preserve memories of those victories. Different regions develop their own heroes. As generations pass, the stories merge. One figure becomes increasingly famous, and victories once attributed to several commanders become episodes in his life. Eventually, history becomes legend. Something similar appears to have happened with Arthur. By the 9th century, traditions involving Ambrosius, Vortigern, Hengist, Saxon settlement, British resistance, prophecy, and Arthur were increasingly being woven into a shared narrative. Later writers would connect these characters even more closely. By the 12th century, the story had expanded enormously. Writers transformed the shadowy war leaders of post-Roman Britain into members of interconnected royal families. Political relationships became blood relationships. Simple battles became grand campaigns. prophets became magicians, warriors became ideal kings, and fragmented traditions were assembled into an increasingly coherent, legendary past. The Norman conquest added another fascinating chapter to Arthur's transformation. When the Normans conquered England in 1066, they entered a society already filled with traditions about Britain's ancient past. Norman and French-speaking aristocratic culture soon became fascinated by Arthurian material. Writers on both sides of the Channel began expanding these stories for aristocratic audiences. Arthur was particularly useful because he was not originally an Anglo-Saxon hero. In the oldest traditions, he had fought against the ancestors of the English. Yet this did not prevent later England from adopting him. Norman aristocratic culture helped transform Arthur from a regional British warrior into an international medieval king. His court became increasingly sophisticated. Knights, tournaments, romantic relationships, magical adventures, and ideals of chivalry entered the tradition. As Norman elite culture blended gradually with the society it had conquered, Arthur's popularity spread even further. By the High Middle Ages, he was no longer simply a hero of Britain's resisting Saxons. He had become a heroic figure embraced throughout England and beyond. There is a remarkable irony here. A legendary warrior remembered for fighting the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons eventually became one of England's greatest national heroes. This transformation demonstrates how historical memory changes according to the needs of later societies. The 5th century Britons may have remembered victories because those memories offered hope during a period of political crisis. Welsh traditions preserved Arthur as a defender of Britain. Medieval writers later reinvented him as an ideal Christian king. French authors transformed his warriors into models of chivalric knighthood. Behind all of these layers, however, remains the question of what actually happened during the 5th and 6th centuries. The details preserved by later sources cannot simply be accepted as literal history. Stories of hundreds of warriors falling before Arthur personally, supernatural dragons beneath fortresses, miraculous prophecies, and elaborate genealogies clearly belong to the development of legend. But the broader picture is much more credible. The Britons did resist the expansion of Germanic-speaking communities. That resistance appears to have achieved meaningful success for a time. Gildas remembers a revival under Ambrosius Aurelianus and a significant victory at Mount Badon. Later traditions preserved the same general memory, while increasingly associating those victories with Arthur. Archaeology provides an interesting parallel. Germanic-associated settlement appears to have accelerated in parts of Britain during the later 5th century, particularly from around the 470s onward. This expansion continued for several decades before the pattern appears to change. Depending on how the uncertain chronology of Gildas is interpreted, such a slowdown could roughly correspond with the period traditionally associated with Mount Badon. That does not prove that Badon caused the change. Archaeological settlement patterns can shift for many reasons, and we cannot confidently connect every demographic development with a battle recorded in a literary source. Nevertheless, the possibility is intriguing. Perhaps a major British victory temporarily prevented further political expansion. Perhaps several conflicts collectively created a period of stability. Whatever happened, Germanic settlement did not advance steadily across Britain without interruption. The balance eventually shifted again. During the 6th century, previously scattered Germanic communities began developing into larger political units. Local rulers expanded their authority, settlements became connected to emerging kingdoms, and warfare increasingly involved organized competition for territory. By the later 6th century, the historical evidence begins to reveal a clearer pattern of expansion toward the west and north. Germanic-speaking rulers were no longer simply leaders of isolated coastal settlements. They increasingly controlled substantial territories and possessed the military resources needed to challenge neighboring British kingdoms. The northern regions provide a striking example. In 547, according to later tradition, the Anglian ruler Ida established himself at Bamburgh, a powerful coastal stronghold in what would eventually become Northumbria. From such centres, expanding dynasties could dominate surrounding territories and challenge British rulers farther inland. This represented a fundamentally different stage from the earliest migrations. The first settlers may often have arrived quietly in small groups, taking advantage of Britain's political fragmentation. Their descendants, however, eventually created kingdoms capable of organized territorial conquest. Migration had become settlement. Settlement had produced communities. Communities developed political identities, and those identities eventually became kingdoms. British resistance, therefore, needs to be understood within this longer transformation. There was no single moment when an Anglo-Saxon invasion began, nor one decisive battle that determined Britain's future. Instead, several generations experienced alternating periods of migration, coexistence, competition, warfare, and expansion. Mountbaden may have represented one important British success within that process. Ambrosius may have been one of the commanders who made such resistance possible. Arthur may preserve a distant memory of another leader, or perhaps the accumulated memories of several. We may never know, yet the uncertainty itself helps explain why Arthur became such a powerful figure. The collapse of Roman Britain left behind a historical landscape filled with gaps. Later generations filled those gaps with stories, and within those stories, the confusing wars of post-Roman Britain were gradually transformed into something far more memorable: the age of King Arthur. The Germanic settlement of Britain did not result in the disappearance of the people who were already living there. There is little evidence for a large-scale extermination or complete expulsion of the native population. Instead, the surviving evidence increasingly points toward a long period in which newcomers and local Britons lived beside one another, intermarried, exchanged customs, and gradually created new communities. One of the most revealing clues comes from something so familiar that it is easy to overlook: place names. Names attached to rivers, hills, valleys, towns, and villages often survive long after political systems and languages have changed. Because of this, they can preserve traces of the people who once inhabited a landscape. In early medieval Britain, many important geographical features continued to carry names derived from Brittonic languages even after Germanic-speaking communities became dominant in the surrounding regions. Several major rivers provide obvious examples. Names such as Severn, Thames, and Avon have roots that predate the Anglo-Saxon settlement. The fact that Germanic-speaking newcomers continued using these names strongly suggests that they learned them from people already living in Britain. A river name is not something easily invented in isolation. Someone arriving in an unfamiliar landscape usually asks the people already there what a river, hill, or road is called. If the newcomers then continue using that name, it implies communication between the populations. The evidence goes beyond the names of famous rivers. Numerous smaller landscape features in eastern Britain also preserve Brittonic elements, including places that would have mattered mainly to the people living locally. This is important because it suggests that native populations remained present even in regions where Germanic language and culture later became dominant. Some major settlements also retained names connected to earlier British traditions. Durham, Lincoln, and Dover are among the places whose names preserve elements older than Anglo-Saxon political control. Their survival suggests continuity rather than a completely empty landscape being repopulated by newcomers. The emerging picture is therefore not one of Germanic migrants arriving in abandoned territory and creating everything from the beginning. In many areas, they entered landscapes that were already inhabited. They joined existing communities, established new farms beside older ones, and over time became increasingly influential within local society. Eventually, the language, customs, and political organization of the newcomers became dominant across large parts of eastern and southern Britain. But dominance is not the same thing as biological replacement. Cemeteries provide even stronger evidence of cultural interaction. Graves from the 5th and 6th centuries often contain combinations of objects and burial customs associated with both Romano-British and continental Germanic traditions. The boundaries between the two populations were therefore much less rigid than older historical narratives once suggested. A person could be buried with a brooch influenced by continental styles, while living in a community that preserved older British practices. Another grave might combine objects traditionally classified as Roman and Germanic. These mixtures demonstrate that people were adopting customs across cultural boundaries. The transformation taking place in Britain was therefore happening at the level of ordinary communities, not simply through armies and kings. To understand why these communities developed as they did, it is necessary to remember the economic conditions of 5th century Britain. The collapse of Roman administration had profoundly damaged the economy of the former province, particularly in the south and east. During the Roman period, wealthy landowners had controlled large estates centered on villas. These estates participated in extensive markets and could produce agricultural surpluses on a substantial scale. They operated within a system supported by roads, towns, taxation, specialized workers, and long-distance trade. Much of that structure disappeared during the 5th century. Some wealthy families probably abandoned their estates, while others simply lost the economic system that had made large-scale villa agriculture possible. The luxurious residences themselves declined, and the countryside became increasingly dominated by much smaller farming communities. The population did not necessarily collapse everywhere, but productivity clearly did. Britain became poorer. Most people living during the 6th century probably inhabited small settlements whose economies were centered almost entirely on agriculture. Families grew crops, raised animals, repaired their own equipment, and relied heavily on what could be produced locally. This was a dramatic contrast with the earlier Roman economy. A prosperous villa estate might once have participated in regional or international markets. A 6th century farming settlement was much more concerned with producing enough food to survive the next winter. The Germanic migrants who arrived in Britain entered this reduced economic world. Many were probably agricultural settlers themselves, and access to land may have been one of the main attractions of migration. Britain offered favorable conditions in certain regions. Soldiers disappeared, the lowlands of the administrative structures weakened, fertile taxation and long-distance economic systems contracted, compared with parts and local communities increasingly solved problems without meaningful assistance from the imperial government. Continued to impose the same fundamental division that had shaped British agriculture for centuries. Southern and eastern Britain were generally flatter and more suitable for growing grain. Northern and western regions contained more hills, mountains, and less easily cultivated terrain, making livestock and pastoral farming more practical. This distinction had existed before Rome, continued through the Roman period, and remained important after Roman government disappeared. The newcomers did not simply impose continental agricultural practices on Britain. They also adopted techniques from the communities they encountered. One example was spelt, an older variety of wheat already cultivated in Britain. Germanic settlers appear to have continued growing it in some areas, demonstrating the persistence of local agricultural knowledge. At the same time, migration introduced changes. Bread wheat became increasingly important and was associated with agricultural traditions brought from continental Europe. Other crops that had been familiar during the Roman period became much less common or disappeared from cultivation altogether. Roman Britain had supported a surprisingly wide variety of fruits, vegetables, herbs, and seasonings through a combination of local cultivation and long-distance commerce. After the Roman economy collapsed, products such as cucumbers, coriander, fennel, turnips, apples, and plums became far less visible in the archaeological record in some regions. Certain crops may have disappeared because the commercial or horticultural systems required to maintain them were no longer functioning. The post-Roman agricultural economy was much simpler. It was also extremely inefficient by modern standards. Across much of early medieval Europe, grain yields were very low. A farmer might harvest only 2 or 3 units of grain for every unit planted as seed. That ratio left little room for error. Part of every harvest had to be stored for planting the following year. Another portion had to feed the community. Animals required resources as well, and losses from pests, weather, disease, and storage problems could reduce supplies further. Very little surplus remained. This meant that a large percentage of the population had to work directly in agriculture, simply to keep society alive. There were fewer resources available to support specialized craftsmen, merchants, administrators, or soldiers than there had been during the height of Roman rule. One failed harvest could have terrifying consequences. Modern archaeology allows us to see those consequences, not only in ruined settlements, but in the bodies of the people themselves. Human remains from early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries preserve a remarkably personal record of life during this period. Bones and teeth can reveal disease, injury, physical stress, childhood malnutrition, repetitive labor, and sometimes even aspects of diet. The dead were treated in several different ways. Two practices dominate the archaeological record: cremation and inhumation. Cremation involved burning the body, often placing the remaining bones in an urn. Inhumation meant burying the body largely intact. Both customs existed among early Germanic-speaking communities in Britain, and the choice could vary between regions and even within the same cemetery. Other methods of disposing of the dead existed as well. Bodies could theoretically be placed at sea or exposed so that animals and natural processes removed the flesh. Such practices leave much weaker archaeological traces, which makes them difficult to detect. Inhumation burials are particularly valuable because complete skeletons preserve extensive biological information. And the picture they provide is often harsh. Many 6th century skeletons show evidence of intense physical work. Everyday life demanded repeated lifting, carrying, grinding, digging, harvesting, and animal management. Female skeletons sometimes show changes in the ankle joints associated with spending long periods squatting close to the ground. Such positions could have been common during tasks like grinding grain, preparing food, textile production, or other household work. Serious injuries were also relatively frequent. Broken bones appear in archaeological populations, many probably resulting from ordinary accidents rather than warfare. Agricultural labor was dangerous. Working with animals, heavy tools, carts, timber, fire, and uneven terrain created countless opportunities for injury. Without modern surgery, antibiotics, or effective pain medication, even a relatively ordinary accident could permanently affect a person's life. Parasitic infections were another persistent problem. Poor sanitation, close contact with animals, contaminated food, and unsafe water created ideal conditions for parasites to spread. Many people probably lived with such infections for years. Dental health was equally poor. Teeth from early medieval cemeteries frequently show severe wear, infection, and decay. Bread and other grain products could contain tiny particles of stone introduced during the grinding process. Repeated consumption gradually damaged tooth enamel. Once a tooth became infected, there was little effective treatment. The pain must sometimes have been extraordinary. Skeletons also reveal widespread arthritis and damage to joints, especially among adults whose bodies had been subjected to decades of strenuous labor. Growing old in this society often meant living with chronic pain. Yet reaching old age at all was far from guaranteed. Infancy and childhood were extraordinarily dangerous. Disease, malnutrition, infection, accidents, and seasonal food shortages killed large numbers of children before they reached adulthood. Surviving childhood did not guarantee a long life. Evidence from some cemeteries suggests very high mortality among young adults. At certain sites in Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire, only a minority of males may have survived beyond roughly 35 years of age. Women faced additional dangers. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the most dangerous experiences in adult female life. Without modern medical care, complications that are routinely treatable today could easily become fatal. As a result, relatively few women in some early medieval cemetery populations survived into advanced adulthood. In certain communities, women's life expectancy may have been lower than men's, reversing the pattern familiar in many modern societies. Not everyone suffered equally. Individual cemeteries reveal striking differences in health and nutrition. At Oakington in Cambridgeshire, for example, a significant proportion of the buried population showed skeletal indicators associated with physiological stress during childhood. One of these is cribra orbitalia, a porous condition visible in the bones around the eye sockets. It can be associated with anemia, nutritional deficiency, infection, or combinations of health stresses. Dental enamel hyperplasia provides another clue. This condition forms when the development of tooth enamel is temporarily disrupted during childhood, often because of severe illness or inadequate nutrition. Once formed, the defect remains visible throughout life. At Oakington, substantial numbers of individuals displayed such signs of childhood stress. Similar evidence appears at other sites. At Norton in County Durham, dental abnormalities connected with childhood physiological stress were even more widespread among the excavated population. These skeletons reveal communities living very close to the limits of survival. Food insecurity was probably a constant concern. A bad harvest, disease among livestock, an unusually severe winter, or conflict with neighboring communities could quickly turn scarcity into famine. Yet conditions were not equally severe everywhere. At Mill Hill in Kent, evidence for dental enamel hyperplasia appears far less frequently than at some other cemeteries. Only a relatively small proportion of individuals showed comparable signs of childhood stress. Why was life apparently better there? The precise answer is impossible to recover. The community may have enjoyed better agricultural land, stronger trade connections, more reliable food supplies, greater political stability, or simply several generations of favorable harvests. Whatever the explanation, the contrast demonstrates that there was no single standard of living across early Anglo-Saxon Britain. Some communities were desperately poor, others were doing noticeably better. By the 6th century, those differences were beginning to appear not only between settlements, but within them. Social inequality was returning. The earliest post-Roman farming communities often appear relatively modest, with limited evidence for enormous differences in wealth. Over time, however, certain individuals accumulated greater resources and status. Cemeteries preserve this development particularly clearly. Most people might be buried with relatively simple objects, while a small minority received elaborate grave goods. Fine jewelry, decorated brooches, weapons, expensive clothing accessories, and swords increasingly distinguished certain graves from those surrounding them. A sword was especially significant. Producing a good weapon required considerable skill, iron, time, and resources. Burying such an object meant removing something valuable permanently from circulation. A grave containing a sword therefore communicated status as much as military identity. Women could also be buried with expensive jewelry or elaborate accessories. Some objects originated stylistically from neighboring regions rather than the immediate community. This suggests that elite families were creating connections beyond their local settlements. Such objects may have arrived through trade, but they could also reflect marriage alliances. A woman wearing jewelry associated with another region may have moved into the community after marrying into a local elite family. If so, marriage was becoming a political instrument through which powerful households created alliances. Either explanation points toward expanding networks. Successful families were no longer confined entirely to isolated farming villages. They were beginning to connect themselves with elites in other settlements, exchanging goods, arranging marriages, and building relationships across wider territories. These networks were the beginnings of political power. A wealthy household could support followers. Followers could provide military strength. Military success could produce additional land and wealth. Wealth could then attract more allies. Through countless small developments like these, local leaders gradually became regional rulers. The process is difficult to reconstruct because written evidence from 6th century Britain is extremely limited. We rarely know the names of the people involved or the exact sequence of events. Archaeology therefore reveals political transformation indirectly. One of the most fascinating signs comes again from clothing and burial. During the 5th century, grave goods were extraordinarily varied. Even within a single cemetery, people might wear objects derived from different continental traditions. There was little sign that an entire community followed one standardized style. By the 6th century, this began to change. Certain regions increasingly developed recognizable patterns of dress, jewelry, weaponry, and burial customs. People living within the same area started using similar objects in similar ways. This growing uniformity was not merely fashion. It may reflect the creation of new regional identities. A brooch or belt buckle could communicate more than wealth. Its design might signal membership in a particular community, political network, or cultural tradition. People were beginning to define themselves collectively. This is one of the most important developments of the entire migration period. The identities that later historians would describe as Anglo-Saxon were not necessarily transported fully formed from continental Europe. The settlers who crossed the North Sea arrived from many different communities with different customs and dialects. Their new identities developed inside Britain. They emerged through interaction with one another and with the surviving British population. At first, the process operated at the scale of individual villages and families. Over time, networks expanded, neighboring communities developed common customs, and regional elites strengthened their authority. Local identities became regional identities. Regional identities eventually became political ones, and political identities would ultimately form the foundations of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The transformation of Britain was therefore much more than a story of migration. It was the creation of entirely new societies from populations of different origins. Britons survived. Germanic migrants arrived. The two interacted, competed, married, traded, worked the same land, adopted elements of each other's traditions, and lived through the same difficult economic conditions. From those everyday encounters emerged a new social landscape. By the end of the 6th century, Britain was no longer Roman, but neither was it simply a continental Germanic society transplanted across the North Sea. It had become something distinct, a collection of new communities whose languages, identities, political structures, and cultural traditions had been created through generations of adaptation within Britain itself. Burial customs revealed that early Anglo-Saxon society was gradually becoming more unequal. This transformation did not appear in exactly the same way for men and women. Among men, one of the clearest signs of elevated standing was the spear. Before around 525 CE, more than 2 out of every 5 male burials contained one. Between roughly 525 and 625, the proportion fell to about 1/3, and after that it dropped below 1/5. This decline probably did not mean that warfare was disappearing from England. Instead, the spear seems to have become a more selective symbol, increasingly reserved for a smaller group of men whose families could claim particular status within their communities. Women were distinguished in a different way. Their graves increasingly displayed valuable ornaments made from materials that had traveled considerable distances. Garnets, amber, and other costly objects began appearing in the burials of certain women, particularly during the 6th century. Such items were far from ordinary possessions. Their rarity, craftsmanship, and foreign origins made them powerful signs of wealth and connection. This was noticeably different from the 5th century, when women's burials generally showed much less variation in the value of the objects placed inside them. Taken together, these changing burial practices point toward an important development. During the 6th century, social differences were becoming more visible and more firmly established. Wealth and prestige were no longer distributed as evenly as they may once have been. Some individuals and families were separating themselves from the rest of the population, creating the beginnings of a more clearly defined hierarchy. Migration may have played an important role in this process. The earliest Germanic settlers in Britain could have created small networks that made it easier for relatives, friends, and other migrants to follow them. Once a community had established itself successfully, newcomers from the same regions of continental Europe would have had somewhere to go and people on whom they could rely. Archaeological evidence from Spong Hill in Norfolk provides an intriguing example of how such a network may have operated. The earliest cremation burials at Spong Hill show particularly strong connections with the region that is now Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany. Later burials reveal a broader mixture of backgrounds, suggesting that the community became more diverse over time. Yet connections with northern Germany did not disappear. People from that region continued to arrive, indicating that migration was not simply a single movement followed by isolation. Contacts across the North Sea remained active for generations. Those connections can also be seen in material culture. Metal objects discovered in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries changed in ways that closely followed fashions developing on the European continent. Some of these objects may have been imported directly, while others could have been produced in Britain by craftsmen familiar with continental styles. In either case, the implication is similar. Communities in Britain were still connected to societies across the sea. Maintaining such connections could provide enormous advantages. Travel, trade, imported goods, and access to distant networks required resources. Families capable of participating in these exchanges could acquire objects that others could not easily obtain, strengthening both their economic position and their reputation. Foreign jewelry, weapons, and other prestigious possessions were therefore more than attractive objects. They could communicate influence, wealth, and access to a much wider world. For most people, however, everyday existence remained demanding. Communities depended heavily on agriculture and had to survive poor harvests, disease, local conflict, and unpredictable environmental conditions. Success was never guaranteed, yet some settlements managed these difficulties better than others, and within those settlements certain households accumulated more resources than their neighbors. A fortunate harvest, control over productive land, successful trade, military ability, or strong family alliances could gradually transform a household's position. These differences did not become kingdoms overnight. They developed slowly. A successful family might first become influential within its settlement. With greater wealth came the ability to support followers, reward allies, arrange advantageous marriages, and defend property. Military strength could then reinforce economic success. Over several generations, a locally important household might become the dominant family across a much larger area. Marriage was especially important because it allowed powerful families to combine their resources and extend their networks. Wealth accumulated by one generation could be inherited by the next, while marriages connected prosperous households to one another. Land, livestock, valuable objects, political relationships, and military support could all become part of an expanding family network. In this way, temporary advantages could gradually turn into lasting hereditary power. Violence also remained an essential part of this process. A family capable of protecting its supporters, defeating rivals, or controlling valuable territory could increase its authority considerably. Some emerging rulers may have created new centers of power, while others probably took control of territories and political structures that had survived in some form from Roman Britain. The landscape of post-Roman Britain was therefore not completely rebuilt from nothing. New political systems sometimes grew alongside or directly on top of older ones. As the strongest families expanded their influence beyond individual settlements, local leadership began developing into regional lordship. A successful leader might command several communities, collect resources from them, gather warriors around himself, and compete with neighboring rulers. His descendants could then inherit not only wealth, but also relationships of loyalty and political authority. Over time, some of these powerful lineages developed into the royal dynasties that dominated early Anglo-Saxon England. The familiar way of describing these kingdoms is through the idea of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. The term refers to 7 major kingdoms later emphasized by the 12th century historian Henry of Huntingdon. Kent is traditionally associated with the Jutes. Essex, Sussex, and Wessex are identified as Saxon kingdoms, while East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria are associated with the Angles. These kingdoms would eventually become some of the most important political powers in early medieval England. But the heptarchy can give a misleading impression of neatness. England was not suddenly divided into 7 clearly defined states. The political landscape was much more fragmented, unstable, and constantly changing. Smaller kingdoms and regional powers existed alongside the famous 7, while borders shifted as rulers fought, formed alliances, married into rival dynasties, or absorbed weaker territories. Even the major kingdoms did not begin in the form in which they are usually remembered. Northumbria, for example, emerged from the combination of earlier political centers, while other kingdoms expanded by bringing neighboring peoples under their authority. Some royal houses rose dramatically and then disappeared. Others survived long enough to construct traditions about their ancestry and origins that made their rule appear older and more legitimate than it may actually have been. The emergence of Anglo-Saxon England was therefore a long process rather than a single political transformation. It grew from migration, trade, agriculture, family alliances, inherited wealth, warfare, and competition between ambitious local elites. The changing contents of graves provide one of the clearest windows into this world. Spears became concentrated among fewer men, expensive ornaments distinguished certain women, and imported objects revealed networks stretching far beyond Britain. Behind these objects was a society reorganizing itself. Small differences in prosperity gradually became larger differences in status. Successful households became influential families. Influential families became regional elites, and some of those elites eventually became kings. By the time recognizable Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged, the foundations of royal power had already been developing for generations. Much of what is traditionally known about the early kingdoms of southern England comes from a source written centuries after the events it describes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was assembled toward the end of the 9th century, during the reign of Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. Because the project emerged from Alfred's kingdom, its attention naturally falls more heavily on southern England, particularly Wessex and its neighbours, than on developments farther north. This makes the Chronicle enormously valuable, but also difficult to use as a straightforward record of the 5th and 6th centuries. Its writers were looking back across several hundred years, relying on earlier traditions, genealogies, stories, and records whose reliability varied considerably. One warning sign is that several accounts describing the creation of southern kingdoms follow remarkably similar storylines. Again and again, a Germanic leader arrives in Britain from across the sea. A few years later, he establishes political control over a territory, usually after winning a short sequence of memorable battles. Several decades pass, and power then moves to his son or another close descendant. Versions of this pattern appear in the traditions of both Kent and Wessex. The similarities are so striking that these stories probably tell us as much about how later Anglo-Saxons wanted to remember their beginnings as they do about what actually happened. Sussex provides another example. The Chronicle places the arrival of a leader named Ella on the southern coast in 477. He supposedly came with 3 sons, Cissa, Caiman, and Walensing. Ella and his followers then fought the people already living in the region as they established themselves along the coast. Later tradition went even further by connecting Ella's sons with particular settlements. Cissa was associated with Chichester, Caiman with a place remembered as Simonshaw, and Walensing with Winchelsea. Such stories created an appealing explanation for the landscape, linking familiar place names with heroic figures from an imagined age of conquest. Whether these connections preserve genuine historical memories is much harder to establish. Essex presents an almost opposite problem. Despite occupying an important position in southeastern Britain and including territory around what would become London, the kingdom's earliest history remains surprisingly obscure. The surviving evidence simply does not allow its development to be reconstructed with anything like the detail traditionally available for some of its neighbours. Wessex is another matter. Of all the southern kingdoms, it eventually became the most consequential. Centuries after its beginnings, Wessex provided the political foundation from which a unified English kingdom emerged during the 10th century. Yet this later success can easily distort our view of its origins. Wessex did not begin as the large and powerful kingdom familiar from later medieval history. It grew gradually from a much more complicated collection of smaller communities and territories. Even the name Wessex belongs primarily to a later stage in this development. The people associated with its earliest ruling dynasty were known as the Gewissae. The meaning of this name remains uncertain, although it has sometimes been connected with an Old English term carrying the sense of something dependable or certain, comparable to modern German Gewis. The settlement history of the region was also different from that of eastern Britain. During the 5th century, the greatest concentrations of Germanic migrants were found farther east. The lands that eventually became Wessex appear to have experienced a more complicated process. A relatively small number of Germanic warriors may initially have entered the region as mercenaries, while other settlers later moved westward from areas where Germanic communities had already become established. Their expansion was certainly not uncontested. Existing British populations remained present, and the political landscape was shaped by encounters between newcomers and communities whose roots stretched back into Roman Britain. Instead of imagining a single invading population sweeping across an empty landscape, it is more useful to picture generations of migration, conflict, negotiation, cultural exchange, and gradual political expansion. At the center of Wessex's traditional origin story stands a mysterious figure named Cerdic. The earliest surviving royal genealogy associated with Wessex was written down in the 10th century, but it appears to preserve material copied from a considerably older manuscript. That earlier version may have been produced around 796, and some scholars have argued for an even earlier date in the 720s. According to this dynastic tradition, Cerdic lived during the early 6th century and became the ancestor of the later kings of Wessex. The story portrays him as a founder who arrived from overseas and established himself through conquest. For later rulers, such an ancestry was extremely useful. It provided their dynasty with an ancient beginning and connected their authority with the heroic age of the first Anglo-Saxon settlements. The historical evidence, however, makes the story much less straightforward. Cerdic cannot accurately be described as the first king of Wessex because there is no clear evidence that a political entity called Wessex existed during his lifetime. Instead, the tradition associates him with the Gewissae, one of the smaller peoples from which the later kingdom developed. The name Wessex does not appear securely as a political designation until 686, roughly a century and a half after the period in which Cerdic supposedly lived. That gap matters. It suggests that later chroniclers projected the kingdom they knew backward into an age when the political map looked very different. What eventually became Wessex was probably created through the gradual absorption and consolidation of several smaller groups, rather than through a single act of foundation. Cerdic's genealogy creates further difficulties. Different surviving versions do not always agree about how he was related to other members of the royal line. These contradictions suggest that even Anglo-Saxon writers of the 8th and 9th centuries possessed only an uncertain understanding of events that had taken place in the 6th century. By their time, fragments of genuine memory had probably become mixed with political tradition, legend, and attempts to create a coherent royal ancestry. Perhaps the most fascinating clue lies in Serdik's own name. Later genealogists connected his family to Woden, the great Germanic ancestral deity claimed by several Anglo-Saxon royal houses. Such a lineage presented the dynasty as unmistakably Germanic. Yet the name Serdik itself is generally regarded as Brittonic rather than Germanic. It is closely related to the Brittonic personal name Seretic, which belonged to the Celtic-speaking population of Britain. This creates an intriguing possibility. Serdik, or at least the historical figure behind the later tradition, may have come from a British background rather than being a Germanic conqueror newly arrived from the continent. If that interpretation is correct, the dynasty may have undergone a gradual transformation of identity. A British ruling family could have entered an increasingly Anglo-Saxon political and cultural environment, adopted its language and customs, and eventually presented itself as part of a Germanic royal tradition. Such a process would not have been unusual in a world where political allegiance and cultural identity could change considerably across generations. Serdik is not the only member of the dynasty whose name raises this possibility. Names such as Seolin, Kedar, and Kedwala also appear to have Brittonic roots, yet they eventually became accepted within Anglo-Saxon naming traditions. Their survival provides a small but revealing glimpse of how closely intertwined the populations of post-Roman Britain could become. This is why the early history of Wessex is so important. It challenges the simple image of clearly separated Britons and Anglo-Saxons confronting one another as two permanently distinct peoples. Warfare and migration certainly occurred, but so did intermarriage, political cooperation, cultural borrowing, and changes of identity. Over generations, communities that had once possessed different backgrounds could become part of the same political society. Ironically, the royal genealogies designed to give Wessex a prestigious story of Germanic conquest may preserve evidence for precisely this mixture. Beneath the legendary ancestors and carefully constructed family trees are traces of a much more complicated Britain, where British and Germanic traditions interacted continuously. The southern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms therefore did not simply appear when individual warlords stepped ashore and declared themselves kings. Kent, Sussex, Essex, and especially Wessex developed through long and uneven processes that later chroniclers compressed into memorable foundation stories. Behind those stories was a far more interesting reality. Small communities becoming larger political units, old populations mixing with newcomers, ambitious families reshaping their identities, and eventually kingdoms emerging from a landscape that had been changing for generations. Among the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Kent stands apart. Later tradition regarded it as the only major kingdom founded by the Jutes rather than by Angles or Saxons. Its legendary beginnings were connected with two of the most famous figures in the story of post-Roman Britain, the brothers Hengist and Horsa. According to the traditional account, Hengist and Horsa crossed the sea not as conquerors, but as hired warriors. They were supposedly invited into Britain by Vortigern, a British ruler who needed military assistance against his enemies. The relationship eventually collapsed. In later versions of the story, the brothers turned against the ruler who had employed them, seized territory for themselves, and helped begin the expansion of Germanic power across Britain. Whether the story preserves real events or later legend is difficult to determine, but it became central to the way Kent remembered its origins. Bede preserves an even more elaborate ancestry for the brothers. Hengist and Horsa were said to descend from figures called Uitgisl, Uita, and Uecta, before their family line ultimately reached the divine world of Germanic tradition. Some of these ancestral names appear closely connected with the Isle of Wight. That connection may not be accidental. Kentish rulers had political reasons to associate themselves with the island, and genealogy could be used as a way of turning territorial ambitions into claims based on ancient ancestry. Traditions of this kind were probably already well established by the end of the 6th century. When Augustine arrived in 597 to begin his Christian mission among the Anglo-Saxons, Kent already possessed a developed royal culture, with stories explaining the origins and legitimacy of its ruling dynasty. Christianization did not immediately destroy these older traditions. Even genealogies containing pagan or semi-divine ancestors survived. For Christian kings, abandoning them would have meant giving up something politically valuable. Ancient ancestry strengthened royal legitimacy, connected rulers with heroic founders, and helped explain why a particular family deserved to govern. Pagan elements could therefore survive inside the historical traditions of kingdoms that had become Christian. Yet Kent's history may reach far deeper into Britain's past than the legends of Hengist and Horsa suggest. Unlike the other major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the territory had possessed a recognizable political identity long before Germanic settlement. The region associated with Kent can be traced back into pre-Roman Britain and was known to ancient Mediterranean writers. The Greek explorer Pytheas, who traveled in the northwestern regions of Europe centuries before the Roman conquest of Britain, appears to have known of the people inhabiting this southeastern corner of the island. By the time of the Roman conquest, the Cantiasi occupied the region, with Canterbury developing as its principal center. Roman rule did not necessarily erase the existing territorial structure. Instead, older patterns of settlement and administration could be adapted to the needs of the new imperial system. Kent therefore retained a strong regional identity throughout the Roman period. This possibility has changed the way historians think about the later Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Rather than imagining Kent as an entirely new state created when Germanic warriors conquered southeastern Britain, it may be more accurate to see substantial political continuity. A territorial unit with roots stretching back before Rome could have survived through the Roman centuries and then passed into the hands of a new ruling elite after Roman authority disappeared. In that interpretation, Hengist and Horsa become part of a much broader transformation. Germanic settlers did not necessarily construct Kent from nothing. They may instead have gained control of an already recognizable territory, inherited some of its institutions and centers of power, and gradually reshaped its identity. The rulers changed, the language and culture evolved, but important elements of the political landscape could remain. Farther north and east, the development of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms followed different paths. Three major powers eventually came to dominate these regions: East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Like Wessex and Kent, however, none should be imagined as appearing fully formed at the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period. East Anglia provides a particularly clear example of political consolidation. Its kingdom emerged from the joining of smaller territories during the 6th century. Two of the most important were associated with the North folk and the South folk, names preserved today in Norfolk and Suffolk. What later appears on a map as a single kingdom therefore began as separate communities that gradually came under common political authority. East Anglia eventually extended westward into parts of what is now Cambridgeshire. By the early 7th century, its rulers had become powerful enough to play a major role in Anglo-Saxon politics. For a time, East Anglia ranked among the leading kingdoms of Britain. That position did not last, however, and its influence later diminished as stronger neighbors competed for supremacy. Mercia followed an even more remarkable path. It eventually became one of the greatest powers in Anglo-Saxon England, dominating large parts of the Midlands and, at moments, exercising influence over much of southern Britain. Yet the beginnings of Mercia remain unusually difficult to reconstruct. One major reason is the absence of an early Mercian historical tradition comparable to the surviving material from some other kingdoms. Much of what is known about Mercia comes from writers whose communities had experienced Mercian aggression or domination. The kingdom's reputation was therefore shaped largely by outsiders, many of whom had little reason to portray its rulers sympathetically. Northumbria was one of Mercia's greatest rivals, and the most influential early English historian, Bede, was himself Northumbrian. His treatment of Mercia is noticeably different from his treatment of kingdoms closer to his own world. He provides relatively little information about Mercian sacred sites and religious traditions, despite showing considerable interest in such subjects elsewhere. His presentation of some Mercian rulers can also appear distinctly unsympathetic. Northumbria itself was not originally a single kingdom. Like East Anglia, it emerged from the combination of earlier political units. In this case, the two principal territories were Bernicia in the north and Deira farther south. Their rulers competed for influence until dynastic marriage helped bring them together during the early 7th century. Even after this union, the distinction between Bernicia and Deira remained important. Their aristocratic families retained separate interests, and rivalry between the two regions continued for generations. Northumbria was therefore less a kingdom created at a single moment than a political partnership that had to be repeatedly maintained. The names Bernicia and Deira provide another clue to the complicated origins of Anglo-Saxon administrative structures weakened, taxation to have long-distance economic systems contracted. This raises the possibility local communities that increasingly solved problems without meaningful assistance from the imperial among the Britannic-speaking population before Anglian dynasties gained control of them. Bernicia offers particularly interesting evidence. Bamburgh, which would become one of the great royal centres of Anglo-Saxon Northumbria, was captured by Anglian forces in the middle of the 6th century, traditionally dated to 547. Its importance did not disappear with the change of rulers. Instead, Bamburgh became a central fortress of the new dynasty and remained one of northern England's most significant centres of power for centuries. A similar pattern can be seen at Yeavering, another important Bernician royal centre. Even its name appears to derive from Britannic rather than Old English. Archaeological evidence suggests continuity between earlier activity in the area and its later use by Anglo-Saxon kings. Once again, political change may have involved new rulers taking control of an existing centre rather than abandoning the old landscape and beginning again somewhere else. As Northumbria expanded, it also incorporated other territories. One important example was Lindsey, centered on the region surrounding Lincoln. Lindsey possessed its own identity before being drawn into the struggles among the larger kingdoms. Its fate demonstrates how the political map of early medieval Britain gradually became less fragmented as successful dynasties absorbed weaker neighbors. Mercia expanded in much the same way. Its eventual size should not be mistaken for its original form. The great Mercian kingdom was assembled piece by piece as rulers extended their authority over smaller peoples scattered across the Midlands. This process also reminds us that British political power did not suddenly disappear when Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged. In parts of northern and western Britain, Britannic communities continued to govern themselves long after Germanic dynasties had become dominant elsewhere. The transition from post-Roman Britain to Anglo-Saxon England could take centuries. One striking survivor was Elmet, a Britannic kingdom located roughly in what is now western Yorkshire. From the 5th century into the 7th, Elmet remained independent despite the growth of powerful Anglian neighbours. Northumbria pressed from the north and east, while Mercian influence developed farther south. For generations, Elmet survived between them. Later Welsh tradition remembered Elmet as part of a wider northern British world known as the Hen Ogledd, meaning the Old North. This term preserved the memory of Britannic-speaking kingdoms that had once occupied extensive territories across northern Britain before being conquered or absorbed by expanding Anglo-Saxon states. Elmet was especially vulnerable because of its geography. Unlike some other Britannic territories, it lacked both a direct connection with another major Celtic-speaking region and convenient access to the sea. As surrounding kingdoms grew stronger, its isolation became increasingly difficult to sustain. Eventually, it disappeared as an independent political entity, and its territory became part of the expanding Anglo-Saxon world. Other small kingdoms experienced similar fates. In the Western Midlands, peoples such as the Wechi and the Magonsat maintained distinct regional identities before eventually falling under Mercian domination. Their disappearance from the political map did not mean that their populations vanished. Instead, their territories and elites were incorporated into larger systems of rule. The rise of the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was therefore largely a story of consolidation. Kent may have inherited a territorial identity reaching back into pre-Roman Britain. East Anglia emerged through the union of smaller peoples. Northumbria grew from Bernicia and Deira and absorbed additional territories, while Mercia expanded across a patchwork of midland communities. What eventually became Anglo-Saxon England was not created by a single wave of conquest sweeping away everything that came before it. The transformation was slower, more regional, and far more complicated. Brittonic kingdoms survived beside Anglo. Saxon ones, older centers of power, were reused by new dynasties, and existing political territories were repeatedly reorganized rather than simply destroyed. Behind the familiar names of Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia lies a landscape once filled with many smaller peoples and competing rulers. Over generations, some disappeared, some merged, and a few expanded dramatically. Out of that constantly changing political world emerged the kingdoms that would dominate the next chapters of early English history. By the closing decades of the 6th century, Britain was divided not only politically and linguistically, but also religiously. Christianity had survived strongly in the Brittonic-speaking regions of the west, southwest, and parts of the north. In fact, these communities were experiencing an important period of religious expansion. Monasteries multiplied, local Christian traditions developed, and monastic communities became influential centers of worship, learning, and social life. The situation was very different in territories controlled by Anglo-Saxon rulers. Christianity had spread considerably through Roman Britain, but across much of the east and south, its institutional presence had weakened dramatically after Roman authority collapsed. A handful of Christian communities probably survived, and certain place names suggest that some churches remained active. Yet these were isolated remnants. The dominant religious culture of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was still pagan. This contrast was closely connected with the origins of the Germanic migrants themselves. Germanic peoples living close to the old Roman frontier on the continent had already encountered Christianity, whether through missionaries, trade, military service, or interaction with the empire. The groups who migrated to Britain, however, came largely from regions farther north, where traditional Germanic religious practices remained strong. Nevertheless, Anglo-Saxon England was never completely cut off from the Christian world. The English kingdoms bordered Christian Brittonic territories and maintained regular connections across the Channel. Merchants, diplomats, warriors, and royal families moved between Britain and continental Europe, carrying ideas as well as goods. Kent was especially exposed to these influences. Its position in southeastern England placed it directly across the Channel from the Frankish kingdoms. By the 6th century, the Franks were firmly associated with Christianity, and commercial and political relations between Kent and the continent were substantial. Christianity, therefore, cannot have been entirely unfamiliar when a group of Roman missionaries finally reached Kent in 597. The mission originated with Pope Gregory I, later remembered as Gregory the Great. Bede preserves a famous story explaining Gregory's interest in converting the English. Before becoming pope, Gregory supposedly encountered several fair-haired captives from Britain being sold in a Roman slave market. Their appearance caught his attention, and after learning where they came from, he became interested in bringing their people into the Christian faith. The story may have been shaped by later tradition, but it captures the importance that Gregory came to attach to the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. According to the account, Gregory initially considered traveling to Britain himself. His popularity in Rome supposedly made that impossible, and he eventually chose another man to lead the mission. That man was Augustine, prior of a monastery in Rome. Augustine would later become known as Augustine of Canterbury, but in 596 he was a monk being asked to undertake an uncertain expedition to a distant island whose language, customs, and political conditions were largely unfamiliar to him. Augustine was not particularly eager to accept the assignment. Britain lay far beyond the familiar Mediterranean Christian world, and stories about its inhabitants apparently made the journey seem even more dangerous. Nevertheless, Augustine departed with a group of fellow missionaries and traveled northward through Europe. They also carried books and other objects required for Christian worship. One remarkable manuscript traditionally associated with the mission is the St. Augustine Gospels. Produced in the 6th century and preserved in England for more than 14 centuries, it remains among the oldest surviving European gospel books. Even after setting out, Augustine's confidence faltered. While traveling through Frankish territory, members of the mission became increasingly concerned about what awaited them. Augustine was sent back to seek Gregory's permission to abandon the expedition. Gregory refused. Instead, he encouraged the missionaries to continue and reminded them of the importance of their task. So they continued through the Frankish lands, eventually crossed the English Channel, and arrived in Kent in 597. Their choice of destination could hardly have been better. Kent was one of the strongest kingdoms in southern England, and its royal household already contained a Christian presence. The king was Ethelbert, one of the most powerful rulers of his generation. More importantly for Augustine, Ethelbert's wife Bertha was already Christian. She was a Frankish princess who had married the pagan Kentish king years before Augustine's arrival. As part of the marriage arrangement, she had been permitted to maintain her religion and had brought a Christian chaplain to Kent. A small Christian foothold therefore already existed at the Kentish court. Bertha worshipped at the old church of St. Martin near Canterbury, and Augustine and his companions were eventually allowed to use the same church. Ethelbert did not immediately abandon his traditional religion, but neither did he attempt to suppress the missionaries. This cautious tolerance gave Augustine the opportunity he needed. The missionaries preached, celebrated Christian services, and gradually attracted followers. Eventually, Ethelbert himself accepted baptism. The conversion of a ruler of his importance transformed Augustine's mission from a small foreign religious enterprise into something capable of reshaping the political and cultural landscape of southern England. Canterbury became the center of Augustine's activities. He established a monastic community there, later remembered as St. Augustine's Abbey, and began creating the institutional foundations of an English church. Priests and deacons were ordained, churches developed, and Canterbury started its long transformation into one of the principal centers of Christianity in England. Yet Augustine faced a difficult question. How quickly should the missionaries attempt to change Anglo-Saxon society? Conversion involved far more than persuading people to accept a new god. Traditional religious customs were woven into festivals, sacred places, political ceremonies, family practices, and community life. Unsure how to handle many of these problems, Augustine sent a series of questions to Gregory. The Pope's answers reveal a notably practical strategy. Rather than attempting to erase every traditional practice immediately, Gregory favored gradual adaptation. Existing customs could sometimes be redirected toward Christian purposes instead of simply being prohibited. The logic was simple. Destroying everything associated with the old religion risked alienating the population. Transforming familiar customs could make Christianity easier to accept. Conversion was therefore not always a sudden replacement of one culture by another. In many cases, older traditions were slowly reinterpreted within a Christian framework. Kent's political influence helped Christianity move beyond Canterbury. Neighboring kingdoms were connected through marriage, diplomacy, trade, and networks of political dependence. Once the Kentish royal court supported the new religion, missionaries gained opportunities elsewhere. In 604, Augustine consecrated 2 new bishops. Mellitus was sent to work among the East Saxons and established his episcopal center in London. Eustace became Bishop of Rochester, only a short distance west of Canterbury. These appointments represented an attempt to turn the original mission into a permanent network of Christian institutions. Progress, however, was anything but smooth. Conversion at the royal court did not necessarily mean that the population had completely abandoned older beliefs. Nor did the baptism of one king guarantee that his successor would remain Christian. Political changes could quickly reverse years of missionary work. Kent itself briefly experienced a pagan reaction after Ethelbert's death. Similar instability appeared elsewhere. East Anglia offers a particularly revealing example through its king Redwald. He encountered Christianity and apparently accepted some form of conversion, but he did not abandon his older religion completely. According to Bede, Redwald maintained a sanctuary containing an altar dedicated to the Christian god, alongside altars used for traditional pagan worship. From a strict Christian perspective, this completely misunderstood monotheism. From Redwald's perspective, however, honoring another powerful divine figure alongside the gods he already knew may have seemed perfectly reasonable. This episode reveals something important about religious change. Christianity was not always accepted in the precise form missionaries intended. New beliefs could be combined with older practices, producing periods of compromise and religious experimentation before a fully Christian system became dominant. Augustine also encountered another major obstacle. Christianity was not actually new to Britain. Brittonic Christians had maintained their own churches, monasteries, clergy, and religious traditions long before the Roman mission arrived. Gregory hoped that Augustine would eventually exercise authority over these existing Christian communities, as well as over newly converted Anglo-Saxons. The British clergy had little reason to accept such an arrangement. They possessed their own traditions and did not consider themselves simply waiting for a Roman missionary to reorganize them. Differences over religious customs and authority made cooperation difficult. Augustine's own approach apparently did little to ease the tension. He expected the British church leaders to accept his leadership, while they resisted what they regarded as outside interference. Meetings between the two sides failed to produce lasting agreement. As a result, Augustine succeeded in establishing a new Anglo-Saxon Christian hierarchy, but failed to unite Britain's different Christian traditions under his authority. Gregory had envisioned something much larger. His plan imagined two great ecclesiastical centres, Canterbury in the south and York in the north. Each archbishop would supervise 12 bishops, producing a network of 24 bishoprics across Britain. It was an ambitious attempt to impose a clear structure on a fragmented political and religious landscape. Reality proved considerably more complicated. Britain contained competing kingdoms, independent British churches, unstable dynasties, and populations whose conversion could advance under one ruler and retreat under the next. Gregory's blueprint, therefore, could not simply be implemented as designed. One remarkable feature of the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons was that it appears to have involved relatively little organized religious violence. Missionaries concentrated their efforts on kings and aristocratic courts rather than attempting to convert entire populations individually. Christianity spread largely from the top downward. The reason was political as much as religious. Anglo-Saxon kings stood at the center of networks of warriors, dependents, relatives, and local elites. When a ruler accepted Christianity, members of his household and many of those who depended upon him often followed. The decision of a single king could therefore influence thousands of people. Royal marriage became one of the most effective channels through which Christianity entered pagan courts. Christian princesses married to non-Christian kings could bring chaplains, attendants, religious books, and Christian practices with them. Their presence created a permanent Christian community inside the royal household itself. These marriages did not guarantee conversion. Bertha had lived with Ethelbert for years before Augustine's mission produced the decisive change at the Kentish court. But elsewhere, marriage opened doors that missionaries might otherwise have struggled to enter. Northumbria provides one of the most famous examples. In 625, King Edwin married Ethelberg, a Christian princess of Kent. She was the daughter of Ethelbert and the sister of Eadbald, who then ruled Kent. When Ethelberg traveled north to join her husband, Christianity traveled with her. Among her entourage was Paulinus, a Christian cleric who would become central to the conversion of Northumbria. Yet Edwin did not immediately accept his wife's religion. Paulinus preached and attempted to win followers, but according to Bede, his early efforts produced little success. Events at the royal court eventually gave Christianity a more powerful opening. Around a year after Edwin's marriage, an assassin arrived with orders from the King of Wessex to kill him. The attacker carried a poisoned weapon and managed to strike at Edwin, but one of the king's loyal retainers placed himself between the assassin and his ruler. The retainer received the attack intended for Edwin and was killed. The king survived. At almost the same time, Queen Ethelberg gave birth to a daughter. Two dramatic events, an escape from assassination and the safe birth of a royal child, now became connected with the religious debate surrounding Edwin. The king initially thanked his traditional gods for his daughter's survival. Paulinus offered a different interpretation. He claimed that his prayers to Christ had helped secure the safe delivery. Edwin was sufficiently impressed to make a conditional promise. If the Christian God granted him victory over the ruler responsible for the assassination attempt, Edwin said that he would accept Christianity. As an immediate gesture, he permitted his infant daughter to be baptized. She therefore became one of the earliest members of Edwin's household formally admitted into the Christian faith. Edwin subsequently campaigned against Wessex and achieved the victory he had hoped for. Yet even then he hesitated. Conversion meant abandoning the religious traditions connected with his ancestors, his kingship, and his political community. For a ruler, this was not simply a private spiritual decision. Pressure continued from several directions. Paulinus remained at court, Ethelberg maintained her Christian faith, and even the papacy became involved. Pope Boniface wrote directly to Edwin, urging him to accept Christianity. Then, in 627, Edwin gathered his leading advisors to discuss the new religion. Bede turns this moment into one of the most memorable scenes in early English history. During the debate, one of the king's advisors described human existence through the image of a small bird entering a warm hall during winter. Outside, darkness and cold surround the building. Inside, the king and his warriors sit around the fire. For a few moments, a sparrow flies through the hall, enjoying warmth and shelter before disappearing through another doorway into the night. The people inside can see the brief moment when the bird passes before them, but they do not know where it came from before entering the hall, nor can they see where it goes after leaving. Human life, the advisor suggested, was much the same. People know the short span between birth and death because they experience it directly. What came before life and what follows, it remain hidden in darkness. If the new religion could provide trustworthy answers about those mysteries, then perhaps it deserved to be heard. For Edwin and his court, Christianity was therefore being presented as more than the religion of foreign missionaries. It offered an explanation for existence itself, where human beings came from, why they lived, and what awaited them beyond death. The debate at Edwin's court would become one of the decisive moments in the Christian transformation of Anglo-Saxon England. The image of the sparrow captured a question that must have felt deeply familiar to Edwin's court. Human beings appear in the world for a short time, live their lives, and then disappear again. What existed before birth and what awaited beyond death remained mysteries. To the advisor speaking before the king, Christianity seemed important because it claimed to provide answers where the traditional beliefs of the community offered less certainty. According to Bede, this argument had an immediate effect on the discussion. One of the most surprising reactions came from Coifi, Edwin's chief pagan priest. Rather than defending the religion he represented, Coifi became one of the strongest voices in favor of abandoning it. He accepted the Christian message and dramatically demonstrated his rejection of the old gods by turning against their sacred places and images. Whether events really unfolded with such theatrical speed is impossible to know. Bede was writing long after Edwin's reign, and the story had already passed through generations of Northumbrian memory. Yet the account preserves something important about how later Christians understood the conversion. The old religious order was not simply defeated from outside. In the story, one of its own leading representatives deliberately rejects it. Edwin himself proceeded more carefully. Becoming Christian was not merely a matter of changing his personal beliefs. Religion was deeply connected with royal authority, communal traditions, and the relationship between a king and his leading followers. A sudden decision by Edwin could therefore have political consequences throughout the kingdom. For that reason, Edwin sought the support of his principal advisors before taking the final step. The king appears in the tradition not as a ruler forcing a new religion upon an unwilling population, but as someone attempting to persuade the political community around him. His conversion needed to become a collective decision if Christianity was to survive beyond the royal household. Eventually, the king's leading men accepted the new faith, and Edwin followed them into baptism. With the court converted, Paulinus suddenly possessed something he had lacked during his earlier years in Northumbria: direct royal support for missionary activity. York became the center of his work. By establishing himself there, Paulinus was also moving toward the much older vision created by Pope Gregory. Gregory had imagined Christianity in Britain organized around two great ecclesiastical centers: Canterbury in the south and York in the north. The conversion of Edwin seemed, for a moment, to make that ambitious plan achievable. From York, Christianity could potentially spread through one of the most powerful kingdoms in northern Britain. Edwin's authority reached far beyond a single settlement, and the conversion of his court opened the way for baptism and missionary activity among communities under Northumbrian influence. Yet Bede's beautiful account should not necessarily be read as a precise record of conversations that took place in 627. Modern historians are generally cautious about accepting every detail literally. Stories preserved orally tend to become cleaner and more dramatic over time. Complicated discussions can become memorable speeches, uncertain decisions can be transformed into decisive moments, and generations of change can be concentrated into a handful of unforgettable scenes. The famous debate at Edwin's court may therefore preserve the memory of a real political and religious crisis without reproducing every word that was actually spoken. The Sparrow, Coife's dramatic rejection of paganism, and the carefully structured arguments may have been shaped during decades of storytelling. But that does not make the tradition meaningless. It tells us how Northumbrians themselves remembered one of the great turning points in their past. Bede probably encountered versions of these stories through the traditions circulating in the region, perhaps even from people whose families preserved memories of the conversion generation. For a brief period, Edwin's baptism seemed to have secured Christianity in Northumbria. But the success proved fragile. The survival of the new religion remained closely tied to the fortunes of the king who had accepted it. Only a few years later, Edwin faced a coalition led by two very different rulers. One was Penda of Mercia, a powerful pagan king whose kingdom was emerging as one of Northumbria's greatest rivals. The other was Cadwallon of Gwynedd, a British ruler who was himself Christian. That alliance is an important reminder that the wars of this period cannot simply be divided into Christians fighting pagans. Political interests were often more important than religious solidarity. A Christian British king could cooperate with a pagan Anglo-Saxon ruler against another Christian king when their strategic interests aligned. Edwin was defeated and killed in battle in 633. His death immediately exposed the weakness of the Christian establishment he had supported. Without the king who had protected the mission, Paulinus could no longer rely on the political security that had made his work possible. Paulinus abandoned his northern headquarters and returned south. Northumbria entered another period of political instability, and the Christian advance there temporarily collapsed. Pagan practices re-emerged, demonstrating once again that converting a king did not necessarily mean permanently converting an entire kingdom. This pattern of advance, retreat, and renewed expansion was characteristic of Christianity's early growth among the Anglo-Saxons. Conversion was not a straight line from paganism to Christianity. A kingdom might accept Christianity under one ruler, reject it under his successor, and embrace it again a generation later. By around 630, Britain therefore presented a remarkably complicated religious landscape. In the West were long-established Britannic Christian communities whose traditions stretched back through the post-Roman period. Their Christianity had developed its own institutions and customs, particularly around monasteries and regional religious centres. In southeastern England, meanwhile, another Christian tradition had begun expanding from Kent. This was the church associated with Augustine's Roman mission and supported by connections with the papacy and continental Christianity. From Canterbury, missionaries had already begun carrying this version of Christianity into neighbouring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms such as Essex and East Anglia. Northumbria occupied a much less secure position. Christianity had entered its royal court through the marriage between Edwin and the Kentish princess Ethelberg, and Paulinus had briefly established a northern mission centred on York. But Edwin's death revealed how shallow those foundations still were. Between these different Christian worlds stood Mercia. It was becoming one of the greatest military powers in Britain while remaining firmly attached to its traditional religion. Mercia was not literally the final pagan territory in England, but among the major kingdoms it became the most important surviving centre of pagan political power. This created an unusual Britain in which religion did not correspond neatly with ethnicity or political allegiance. Britannic rulers could be Christian while fighting Anglo-Saxon Christians. Pagan Anglo-Saxon kings could cooperate with Christian British rulers. Newly converted kingdoms could return to paganism, while Christian princesses carried their religion into foreign royal courts. The Christianization of England was therefore not a simple story of missionaries arriving and replacing paganism. It was a long contest shaped by dynastic marriages, royal deaths, warfare, diplomacy, personal conviction, and political opportunity. Christianity had gained powerful supporters by the early 7th century, but its victory was far from guaranteed. Edwin's story captures that uncertainty perfectly. His conversion briefly appeared to open northern England to a permanent Christian future. Within only a few years, his kingdom had been defeated, its missionary leadership had fled, and paganism had returned. Christianity was spreading, but the religious future of Anglo-Saxon Britain was still very much undecided.